Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world where Christmas was forbidden, where singing carols could get you arrested, and where the holiday we know and love today simply didn't exist. Imagine waking up on December 25th in England, and it's just another working day. No decorations, no gifts, no celebration. For nearly 200 years, this was reality. Tonight, we're travelling back to the darkness before the magic, to a time when Christmas was dying and nobody knew if it would ever return. Before we step into this forgotten world together, I'd love it if you could help this channel grow. If you're someone who loves diving deep into history's most fascinating stories, hit that subscribe button. And if tonight's story moves you, if it makes you see Christmas differently, leave a like. I always read your comments, so tell me, where are you watching from right now? And what's your favourite Christmas tradition? I'm genuinely curious. Now dim those lights, get comfortable under your blankets, maybe let a little background noise from a fan or soft rain sounds keep you company. Let's travel back in time, together. December 24th, 1657. London. A family sits quietly in their home. The father glances nervously at the window. His wife holds their young daughter close. On the table, no feast, no special meal, just ordinary bread and broth. The same thing they ate yesterday, the same thing they'll eat tomorrow. "Papa," the little girl whispers, the old stories grandmother told about the Christmas feast. Were they real? The father puts a finger to his lips. "Shh, child. We don't speak of such things. Not anymore." Outside, in the cold December darkness, soldiers patrol the streets. They're looking for anyone who dares to celebrate, anyone who dares to make this day special. Because in Cromwell's England, Christmas is a crime. This isn't fiction. This is history. In 1647, the English Parliament, under the control of Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan government, did something almost unthinkable. They cancelled Christmas. Not just discouraged it, not just frowned upon it, they literally banned it by law. The official decree stated that December 25th was to be observed as a fast day, a day of repenting for sins, not a day of celebration. Shops were ordered to stay open. Anyone caught celebrating could be fined or arrested, and they were serious about it. In the streets of London, soldiers would walk from house to house, peering into windows, searching for any signs of festivity. Was that the smell of roasting meat? Suspicious. Were those people singing? Arrest them. Did someone dare to decorate their home with holly and ivy, the traditional greenery of Christmas? That family would be reported to the authorities. The Puritans believed that Christmas had become too pagan, too indulgent, too focused on feasting and drinking and merrymaking. They looked at the way people celebrated, the wild parties, the excessive drinking, the carnival-like atmosphere, and they said, "This is not godly, this is not holy, this must stop." And you know what? In some ways, they had a point. Medieval and Tudor Christmas celebrations were absolutely wild. We're talking 12 days of non-stop partying. Lords would hold massive feasts where hundreds of people would eat and drink until they literally couldn't anymore. There were games, gambling, cross-dressing, role reversals where servants became masters for a day. The whole social order turned upside down. It was like New Year's Eve, Halloween, and Mardi Gras all rolled into one, times 12. The Puritans looked at this chaos and said, "Nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus was born on December 25th. This is just a pagan Roman festival that got renamed. We're Christians. We should worship God soberly and seriously, not through drunken revelry." So they killed Christmas. For 13 years, from 1647 to 1660, Christmas was officially illegal in England. But here's what's fascinating. People didn't just accept it. In Canterbury, in 1647, when the town crier announced that everyone must work on Christmas Day, riots broke out. People fought back. They wanted their Christmas. Not for religious reasons necessarily, but because it was their one time of year to rest, to feast, to forget about the grinding poverty and hardship of daily life. The government crushed these rebellions. Christmas went underground. Families celebrated in secret behind closed doors with curtains drawn. They whispered their carols instead of singing them. They hid their decorations. They pretended to work while their hearts yearned for celebration. For 13 years, Christmas became a ghost, present in memory but absent from life. Then, in 1660, everything changed. Charles II, the son of the king Cromwell had executed, returned to England and restored the monarchy. One of his first acts, he brought Christmas back. The people rejoiced. Churches rang their bells. Families feasted. For one beautiful moment, it seemed like Christmas had been saved. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Even though Christmas was legal again, it never fully recovered. Think about it. An entire generation had grown up without Christmas. Children born in 1647 were 13 years old in 1660. They had no memory of public celebrations, no memory of the old traditions. The continuity had been broken. The knowledge of how to celebrate, the songs, the customs, the rituals, had been scattered and lost. By the early 1700s, Christmas in England had become awkward. Some families still tried to celebrate it. Others ignored it completely. It wasn't illegal anymore, but it wasn't popular either. It was this weird, half-forgotten holiday that nobody quite knew what to do with. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, Christmas was thriving. In Germany, families had been decorating evergreen trees in their homes for centuries. In Catholic countries like France, Italy, and Spain, Christmas remained one of the most important holidays of the year, with elaborate church services, nativity scenes, and festive meals. But in Protestant England, Christmas was dying a slow, quiet death. Here's a mind-blowing fact. By the 1820s and 1830s, just a few years before Queen Victoria took the throne, many English people didn't even get Christmas Day off work. It was just another day. Some wealthy families might host a modest dinner. Some churches held services. But there was none of the magic, none of the wonder, none of the universal celebration we associate with Christmas today. If you were a working-class person in London in 1835, your Christmas probably looked like this. You'd wake up before dawn just like any other day. You'd walk to the factory or the shop where you worked. You'd labour for 12, maybe 14 hours. You'd come home exhausted. Maybe, if you were lucky, you'd have a slightly better meal than usual. Maybe you'd tell your children a story about the old days, when Christmas meant something. But that's it. No presents, no tree, no carols sung in the streets, no stockings hung by the chimney, nothing. The holiday that would become the most celebrated day of the year in much of the Western world was, in England in the early 1830s, barely clinging to life. But something was about to change. Someone was about to change it. In 1837, an 18-year-old girl became Queen of England. Her name was Victoria. She was young, she was idealistic, and she was about to marry a German prince who would bring with him a tradition that would transform Christmas forever. But before we meet Prince Albert and discover how he sparked the Christmas Renaissance, we need to understand just how far Christmas had fallen. We need to feel that absence, that loss, that darkness, because only then can we truly appreciate the magic that was about to be reborn. Sitting here tonight, In our world of Christmas lights and holiday music and gift-wrapped presents under decorated trees, it's almost impossible to imagine a world without Christmas. But that world existed. In England, for generations. People lived their entire lives barely knowing what Christmas was supposed to be. The question isn't just, how did Christmas die? The real question is, how did it come back from the dead? And that's where our story truly begins, with a young queen, a German prince, and a simple evergreen tree that would change the world. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't just about pretty decorations. It was about something deeper, something that spoke to the human need for light in the darkness, for hope in despair, for magic in an increasingly industrial world. We'll discover all of that in just a moment. But first, let's meet the man who brought Christmas back to England, and who did it through the most powerful force in the world, love. Picture this. October 1839. A 19-year-old prince steps off a boat onto English soil. His name is Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He speaks English with a thick German accent. He's never been to England before. He's nervous, homesick, and utterly unprepared for what's about to happen. Within days, Queen Victoria, who had met Albert briefly when they were both teenagers, falls completely, hopelessly, head over heels in love with him. And I mean completely. This isn't some arranged political marriage where two royals tolerate each other for the sake of duty. Victoria's diary entries from this period read like something out of a romance novel. She describes Albert as beautiful, excessively handsome, with such a sweet expression. She writes that his eyes are large and blue, his nose exquisite, his mouth very pretty. The girl was absolutely smitten. On October 15th, 1839, just 5 days after Albert arrived, Victoria proposed to him. Yes, she proposed to him. Because she was the queen, protocol demanded that she do the asking. Can you imagine how nerve-wracking that must have been? Even queens get nervous about confessing their feelings. Albert said yes, obviously. They married on February 10th, 1840 in the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace in London. Victoria wore a white dress, which was unusual at the time. Most brides wore colourful gowns and started a trend that continues to this day. But that's a story for another time. What matters for our story is this. Albert was deeply, profoundly homesick. You have to understand, Albert didn't choose to come to England. He was born in Germany, raised in Germany, spoke German as his first language. All his childhood memories, all his traditions, all the things that made him feel safe and at home, they were German. And suddenly, at 20 years old, he's transplanted to a foreign country where people speak a different language, eat different food, follow different customs. A country where, by the way, many people resented him for being German and saw him as an outsider stealing their queen. The English press was brutal to him in those early years. They called him a foreigner. They questioned his loyalty. They mocked his accent. Parliament even refused to give him the title Prince Consort for years. He was just Prince Albert, like he was some guest who might leave at any moment. Albert was lonely, desperately lonely, and loneliness has a funny way of making us cling to the traditions of home. December 1840, Albert and Victoria's first Christmas as a married couple. They're at Windsor Castle, that massive ancient fortress that had been home to English monarchs for centuries. It's cold, it's formal, it's very, very English. And Albert is miserable. He misses his family. He misses Germany. He misses the way Christmas felt when he was a child, the warmth, the magic, the sense of wonder. In Germany, Christmas wasn't a dying, half-forgotten holiday. It was alive, vibrant. In German homes, families would bring an evergreen tree indoors, decorate it with candles and handmade ornaments, and gather around it on Christmas Eve to sing and exchange gifts. It was beautiful. It was meaningful. It was home. So Albert did something that seemed, at the time, quite strange to the English people around him. He had servants bring a fir tree, a whole tree, into Windsor Castle. He had it set up in one of the rooms, and then he decorated it, German style, with candles, cookies, fruits, and small toys. Victoria was charmed. She'd never seen anything like it. In her journal, she wrote about how the tree was lit up by many little candles, and how it created such a festive atmosphere. She loved it. More than that, she loved seeing Albert happy, seeing him smile, seeing a little bit of that homesickness fade from his eyes. But here's the thing, nobody else saw it. This was a private celebration, just the royal family, behind closed doors. The British public had no idea that their queen was standing in front of a Christmas tree, and if they had known, they probably would have thought it was weird. Because remember, in 1840, Christmas trees weren't a thing in England. They were seen as a strange German custom, foreign, other. The tree might have remained Victoria and Albert's private tradition, a sweet, intimate thing they did together, if not for what happened 8 years later. 1848, this is the moment. This is when everything changes. The Illustrated London News, one of the most popular publications in England, publishes an engraving of the royal family celebrating Christmas. And right there, in the centre of the image, is a Christmas tree. The image shows Victoria and Albert standing on either side of the tree with their children gathered around. The tree is decorated with candles, ornaments, and presents hanging from the branches. At the top of the tree, and this is important, there's a small figure, an angel or a star. The family looks happy, peaceful, together. The caption reads, "Christmas tree at Windsor Castle." Now, let me tell you something about the power of images. We live in a world of Instagram and TikTok where we're bombarded with images every second of every day. But in 1848, images were rare, precious. When a magazine published an engraving, people studied it. They talked about it. They showed it to their neighbours. An image in the Illustrated London News could reach hundreds of thousands of people, and those people would actually pay attention. And this image of the royal family around their Christmas tree, it went absolutely viral. Suddenly, everyone wanted a Christmas tree. Not because it was German, not because it was traditional, but because the Queen had one. You have to understand the psychology at play here. In Victorian England, class aspiration was everything. The growing middle class, factory owners, merchants, professionals, they had money now, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. But they didn't have status. They weren't aristocrats. They weren't born into the upper classes. So they did what middle classes have always done. They copied the people above them. If the Queen decorated a Christmas tree, then by God they would decorate Christmas trees too. And it wasn't just about copying. The image that the Illustrated London News published was carefully crafted, probably more carefully than anyone realised at the time. It showed the royal family as a family, not as distant godlike figures, not as cold, formal rulers, but as parents and children, gathered together, celebrating a holiday. It made the monarchy seem relatable, warm, human. This was revolutionary. For centuries, monarchs had maintained their power through distance, through mystery, through being fundamentally different from ordinary people. But Victoria and Albert were selling a different vision. We're just like you. We have children. We celebrate holidays. We value family time. And people ate it up. By the 1850s, Christmas trees were everywhere in middle-class English homes. You could buy decorations at shops. Street vendors sold small fir trees. Books and magazines published instructions on how to decorate your tree in the German fashion. What had been a private, intimate tradition for Albert had become a national phenomenon. But here's what I find most beautiful about this story. Albert never meant for any of this to happen. He wasn't trying to start a trend. He wasn't trying to revive Christmas. He was just homesick. He just wanted a piece of his childhood back. He just wanted to feel, for one night a year, like he was home. And somehow, that simple, honest, deeply personal desire transformed an entire culture's relationship with Christmas. Think about that for a moment. One man's nostalgia became a nation's tradition. One man's loneliness became the seed of joy for millions. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that the most human thing? Now, I want to be clear about something, because historians argue about this. Victoria and Albert did not invent the Christmas tree. Trees had been used in pagan winter celebrations for centuries. German families had been decorating Christmas trees since the 1500s. There are even records of Christmas trees in England before Victoria. Queen Charlotte, the wife of George III, had set up a Christmas tree at Windsor Castle back in 1800. But nobody cared about Queen Charlotte's tree. It didn't spread. It didn't catch on. It remained an obscure curiosity. So what was different about Victoria and Albert's tree? Timing, media, and love. By 1848, England was ready for Christmas to come back. People were exhausted from the Industrial Revolution's grinding, relentless pace. They were working in factories, living in cities, disconnected from the old rural rhythms of life. They were craving something to bring them together, something to make them feel human again. And there was a new middle class with disposable income and a desire to create a warm, respectable home life, to prove they were cultured, that they had values, that they were good people. The Christmas tree offered all of that. It was beautiful, it was family-oriented, it was respectable. And now, thanks to mass media, everyone could see exactly how it was done. But I think there's another reason Victoria and Albert's tree captured people's imagination, and it's something we don't talk about enough: their love story. Everyone knew Victoria adored Albert. Everyone knew this was a genuine love match, not just a political arrangement. And when people saw that image of them standing together by the tree, with their children, they weren't just seeing a decoration. They were seeing a vision of what love looks like, what family looks like, what happiness looks like. The tree wasn't just evergreen branches and candles. It was a symbol of love, of home, of belonging. And isn't that what we all want, especially at Christmas? By the time Albert died in 1861, devastating Victoria, who would mourn him for the rest of her life, the Christmas tree was firmly established in British culture. It had spread to America, where it became even more popular. Today, the tradition is so universal that we can barely imagine Christmas without it. But every Christmas tree in every home, every shopping mall, every town square, every single one traces back to a homesick German prince who just wanted to remember his childhood. Victoria continued the tradition after Albert died. Every Christmas until the end of her life in 1901, she had a tree set up at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, where she and Albert had spent so many happy holidays. The servants would decorate it exactly as Albert had liked it. Victoria would sit beside it, remembering, grieving, but also feeling close to him, if only for a moment. That's the power of tradition, isn't it? It connects us across time. It lets us reach back and touch the people we've lost. It makes the dead feel present, alive, real. But Albert's Christmas legacy didn't stop at the tree. He had awakened something in the English people, a hunger for Christmas magic, for ritual, for celebration, and once that hunger was awakened, it demanded to be fed. Other traditions began to emerge, to flourish, to spread, and one of them, one simple, brilliant innovation, would revolutionize not just Christmas, but human connection itself. It started with an artist, a printing press, and 1,000 cards that almost nobody wanted to buy. But we'll discover how that failure became one of the most enduring Christmas traditions of all, in just a moment. London, December 1843. Sir Henry Cole has a problem. Actually, he has about 200 problems. 200 friends, colleagues and acquaintances he needs to send Christmas greetings to. And it's already mid-December. Now, you might be thinking, 200 Christmas cards? That doesn't sound too bad. I could knock that out in an evening. But here's the thing. Christmas cards don't exist yet. Henry Cole would have to sit down with pen and ink and write 200 individual letters. By hand, in Victorian script, with perfect penmanship, because anything less would be considered rude. Have you ever tried to handwrite just 10 thank you notes? How long did that take you? Now multiply that by 20. That's Henry Cole's December. And Cole is not someone with a lot of free time. He's already one of the busiest men in London. He's a civil servant, a designer, an innovator. He's working on postal reform. He's planning what will eventually become the Victoria and Albert Museum. He'll be its first director. He's involved in organising the Great Exhibition of 1851. The man has approximately 17 jobs and exactly 0 hours to write Christmas letters. So he sits at his desk one evening staring at a stack of blank paper and thinks, there has to be a better way. And that thought, that single moment of frustration, is about to change Christmas forever. But to understand why Cole's idea was revolutionary, we need to talk about something that had just transformed England 3 years earlier, the penny post. Before 1840, sending mail in England was expensive, really expensive. The cost of sending a letter was based on distance and number of pages, and the recipient, not the sender, had to pay. Imagine ordering something online and the delivery person shows up at your door demanding payment before they'll hand it over. That's how mail worked. This meant most ordinary people never sent letters. It was a luxury for the wealthy. If you wanted to communicate with someone far away, you'd have to wait until you saw them in person, or send a message through a travelling acquaintance, or just not communicate at all. But in 1840, a man named Rowland Hill revolutionised the system. He introduced the penny post, 1 penny to send a letter anywhere in Britain, prepaid by the sender using an adhesive stamp. The first postage stamp ever created, the penny black, went on sale in May 1840. This was like the internet being invented. Suddenly everyone could afford to send mail. Working-class people could write to their families. Lovers separated by distance could exchange letters. Businesses could communicate with customers across the country. The volume of mail exploded. In 1839, before the penny post, about 76 million letters were sent in Britain. By 1849, that number had jumped to 329 million. Think about that. A more than 4-fold increase in just 10 years. People were discovering the joy of written connection. And Henry Cole, who had actually worked with Rowland Hill on the postal reforms, saw an opportunity. If everyone could now afford to send mail, why not create a pre-printed greeting card that people could send for Christmas? Now, this might not sound revolutionary to us. We're used to buying cards for every occasion. Birthday cards, sympathy cards, congratulations cards, sorry your goldfish died cards. But in 1843, this concept didn't exist. If you wanted to send someone a greeting, you wrote them a letter. a unique, personal, handwritten letter. Cole's idea was, what if the greeting could be printed? What if an artist could design something beautiful, a printer could reproduce it 1,000 times, and people could simply add their signature and send it? It would save time, it would be convenient, it would make seasonal greetings accessible to everyone, not just those with perfect penmanship and hours of free time. Cole commissioned an artist friend named John Colcott Horsley to design the card. And here's where things get interesting, because the card Horsley created was controversial. Shockingly controversial. The design showed a Victorian family, 3 generations gathered together. In the centre panel, they're raising glasses in a toast. Adults are drinking wine. Even the children appear to be sipping from glasses. On either side of this central image are smaller panels showing acts of charity. Feeding the hungry, clothing the poor. At the top, the text reads, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." The card was lithographed, a printing technique that allowed for colour and hand-coloured. It was beautiful, sophisticated, expensive to produce. Cole had 1,000 of them printed. He sold them in his art shop, Felix Summerlee's Home Treasury Office, for 1 shilling each. Now, a shilling in 1843 was not cheap. For context, that penny post letter cost 1 penny. Cole's card cost 12 times that. For working-class people, a shilling was several hours' wages. This was a luxury item. But Cole wasn't marketing to working-class people. He was marketing to people like himself, the rising middle class, people with disposable income who wanted to appear cultured and modern and connected to the latest trends. Surely, he thought, his 200 friends and acquaintances would love these cards. Surely other people facing the same problem, too many people to write to, too little time, would snap them up. The cards went on sale in December 1843. They were a complete failure. Almost nobody bought them. Out of 1,000 cards printed, Cole sold maybe a dozen. Maybe. Why? Well, remember that controversial design I mentioned? Victorians were outraged. They looked at that image of children drinking wine and lost their minds. How dare you depict children consuming alcohol? This is promoting drunkenness. What kind of immoral message is this sending? You have to understand, Victorian England was in the midst of a massive temperance movement. People were crusading against alcohol, seeing it as the root of all social ills, and here was Henry Cole, printing cards that showed children raising glasses at Christmas. He'd miscalculated. Badly. The few people who did buy the cards probably kept quiet about it, not wanting to be associated with such scandal. The art shop where Cole sold them was an obscure location. There was no advertising campaign, no way for the idea to spread. Henry Cole's revolutionary Christmas card idea died on arrival. Almost all of those 1,000 cards ended up in a warehouse somewhere, gathering dust. And here's where the story could have ended. A good idea, ahead of its time, that nobody wanted. History is full of those. But something fascinating happened, though it took nearly 30 years to unfold. The reason Christmas cards eventually succeeded wasn't because people suddenly decided Cole's design was fine. It wasn't because of brilliant marketing or celebrity endorsement. It was because the world changed. Remember that explosion in mail volume after the penny post? It kept growing and growing. By 1870, the Postal Service introduced an even cheaper rate, the halfpenny postcard. You could now send a postcard anywhere in Britain for half a penny. Suddenly, sending seasonal greetings wasn't expensive anymore. It was accessible to almost everyone. At the same time, advances in printing technology made producing colourful illustrated cards much cheaper. What had cost a shilling in 1843 could be mass-produced for pennies by the 1870s. And, this is crucial, By the 1870s, Christmas was exploding in popularity. Thanks to Prince Albert's Tree, thanks to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, published the same year as Cole's Card, 1843. Thanks to the revival of old carols and traditions, Christmas had gone from a dying holiday to the biggest celebration of the year. People wanted to participate. They wanted to mark the occasion. They wanted to feel connected to this growing cultural phenomenon. And sending cards, beautiful, printed cards, was the perfect way to do it. By 1880, Christmas card production had become a massive industry. Publishers were printing millions of cards every year. You could buy them at corner shops, from street vendors, through catalogues. There were cards for every taste, every budget, every sentiment. And this is where Victorian Christmas cards get wonderfully weird. Because unlike modern Christmas cards, which are mostly sentimental, with images of Santa and snowmen and cosy fireplaces, Victorian Christmas cards were bizarre, delightfully, disturbingly bizarre. There were cards featuring dead robins lying in the snow, cards showing anthropomorphic frogs in top hats, cards with children being kidnapped by Santa Claus and stuffed into his sack, cards depicting giant insects dancing, cards showing vegetables with human faces. One popular card design featured a frog brutally murdering another frog and stealing its possessions. I am not making this up. Modern historians are still debating why Victorians loved such dark, macabre imagery on their Christmas cards. Some theories suggest the dead robin symbolised poor children freezing to death, a way to evoke sympathy and encourage charity. Others think the weird, unsettling images were meant to be conversation starters. You'd send someone a card with a murderous frog and they'd be so bewildered they'd have to talk about it. Remember, Victorians were obsessed with death and the supernatural. This was the era of seances, of mourning jewellery made from dead people's hair, of elaborate funeral rituals. They didn't see death as something to hide from. They saw it as a natural part of life, something to acknowledge, even during celebrations. But there's another theory I find compelling. Maybe the macabre Christmas cards reflected the tension at the heart of Victorian Christmas, the collision between the magic and the melancholy, between the idealised vision of family joy and the harsh reality of poverty and loss that surrounded so many people. Not everyone could afford that perfect Christmas. Not every family was gathered around a tree in warmth and comfort. The dark Christmas cards acknowledged that. They said, yes, we're celebrating, but we're not forgetting the darkness. We're not pretending everything is perfect. How different is that from our modern Christmas cards? We carefully curate images of our happiest moments, our most photogenic family gatherings, our most picturesque decorations. We show the magic, not the melancholy. We hide the imperfections. Maybe the Victorians, in their strange way, were more honest than we are. By the end of the Victorian era, around 1900, sending Christmas cards had become an absolute obligation. Middle-class families would send out hundreds of cards each year and expect to receive just as many. It became a measure of social standing. The more cards you received, the more popular and well-connected you were. People would display them in their homes, lining them up on mantelpieces and hanging them from ribbons, showing off their social network to visitors. Does that sound familiar? Isn't that essentially what we do on social media today? Posting our Christmas celebrations, counting our likes and comments, curating our image. The Christmas card wasn't just a way to send greetings. It was the Victorian version of social media, a way to maintain connections, to signal status, to participate in a shared cultural moment. And it all started because one man was too busy to write letters. Henry Cole died in 1882, having lived long enough to see his failed idea become a massive success. Those original cards from 1843 The scandalous ones with the children drinking wine are now incredibly valuable. One sold at auction in 2001 for nearly $9,000, about $12,000, for a card that originally cost a shilling and that nobody wanted to buy. Today, billions of Christmas cards are sent every year worldwide. Digital cards have added to the tradition rather than replacing it. We found even more ways to stay connected during the holidays, but I wonder, have we lost something in the efficiency? When Henry Cole was writing those 200 letters by hand, each one was unique, personal. It took time and effort. The recipient knew Cole had spent part of his evening thinking about them specifically, forming words just for them. Now we can send 100 identical cards in an hour. We can post one Facebook message that reaches everyone we know. We've gained convenience, but maybe we've lost intention. Then again, maybe that's not fair. Maybe the Victorians who bought printed cards felt the same guilt, like they were taking a shortcut, like a printed greeting wasn't as meaningful as a handwritten letter. And yet, the card still conveyed something important. I'm thinking of you. You matter to me. I want to mark this moment with you. Perhaps that's what matters. Not the medium, but the meaning. Not the format, but the feeling. The Christmas card revolution taught us something profound. Connection doesn't have to be perfect to be real. A mass-produced card with a personal signature can still make someone feel loved. A brief greeting can still matter. Sometimes reaching out imperfectly is better than not reaching out at all, because we're waiting for the perfect moment or perfect words that never come. But while Henry Cole was struggling with his printing press, trying to sell cards that nobody wanted, something else was happening in England. Something darker. Something that would make the happy families on Christmas cards seem like a cruel joke to thousands of people. Because while the middle class was inventing new ways to celebrate, the poor were literally starving, and the contrast between Christmas magic and Christmas misery was about to reach a breaking point that would shake the nation's conscience. That's where we're headed next. There's a London you don't see on Christmas cards, a London that exists just streets away from those warmly lit windows and decorated trees, a London where Christmas isn't magic, it's mockery. The 1840s. Historians call this decade the Hungry Forties, and the name isn't poetic, it's literal. People were starving. While Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were perfecting their Christmas tree traditions, while Henry Cole was printing his cards, while middle-class families were learning to celebrate the holiday in new and wonderful ways, millions of people in Britain were facing a question more urgent than what to put under the tree. Will we eat today? Let me take you there. Really take you there. Because this is the part of the Victorian Christmas story that gets left out of the cosy narratives. Ireland, 1845. A farmer walks into his potato field and stops cold. Yesterday the plants were green and healthy. Today they're black, rotting. The leaves have turned to slime overnight. He digs up a potato. It crumbles in his hands, putrid and oozing. Within weeks, the entire Irish potato crop is destroyed by a fungus called Phytophthora infestans. And here's the terrifying thing. Potatoes were not a luxury crop in Ireland. They were survival. For millions of poor Irish families, potatoes were breakfast, lunch and dinner, literally. Some families ate nothing but potatoes 3 meals a day, every day. When the potatoes died, the people started dying too. Over the next 7 years, approximately 1 million Irish people starved to death. 1 million. Another million emigrated, fleeing to America, Canada, Australia, anywhere that wasn't this nightmare. Ireland's population dropped by 25%. Can you imagine that? 1/4 of an entire nation gone. Now you might be thinking, but this is a story about English Christmas. Why are we talking about Ireland? Because the famine didn't stay in Ireland. Irish refugees flooded into English cities, particularly London, Manchester, Liverpool. They arrived starving, diseased, desperate. English cities that were already overcrowded, already struggling with poverty and sanitation, suddenly had to absorb hundreds of thousands of destitute people. But it wasn't just the Irish immigration that made the 1840s hungry. England was experiencing its own economic crisis. The Industrial Revolution had promised prosperity, and for some people, factory owners, merchants, investors, it delivered. But for the workers, for the people actually making the products, working the machines, building the infrastructure, they were trapped in a brutal cycle of low wages and high costs. The price of bread, the staple food for working-class families, remained stubbornly high throughout the 1840s, partly due to the Corn Laws that protected wealthy landowners' profits. Meanwhile, wages stayed flat or decreased. As industrial production ramped up, more people flooded into cities looking for work, and basic economic supply and demand meant employers could pay less and less. A working-class family in London in 1845 might have a father working 14 hours a day in a factory earning perhaps 10 shillings a week. Sounds like it might be enough, right? Until you realise that a single loaf of bread cost about 4p. Rent for even the most miserable room, one room for an entire family, might be 3 shillings a week. Coal for heating, another shilling. That leaves maybe 5 shillings for everything else. Food, clothing, shoes, anything that breaks or wears out. Do the math. A family of 5 needs to eat. That 5 shillings has to buy food for 7 days. That's about 8.5p per day for the entire family. Less than a penny per person per meal. What can you buy for less than a penny in 1840s London? Stale bread, watered-down milk, rotten vegetables that markets couldn't sell, and if you were lucky, oysters. Yes, oysters. Here's something that blows modern minds. In Victorian England, oysters were poor people's food. Today, oysters are fancy, expensive. You order them at upscale restaurants and feel sophisticated. But in the 1840s, oysters were so abundant and cheap that they were basically fast food for the working class. Charles Dickens, in the Pickwick Papers, has a character observe, "Poverty and oysters always seem to go together." Another character notes that oysters are consumed by the poor in great quantities. The Thames River and the coastal waters around England were absolutely teeming with oysters. You could buy them from street vendors for pennies. They were filling. They were protein. They didn't require cooking, crucial for families who couldn't afford coal for a fire or didn't have a stove. So picture this. Christmas Eve, 1846. A working-class London family, father, mother, 3 children, sits down to their holiday meal. On the table, a small pile of oysters, some stale bread, and if they're incredibly fortunate, maybe a potato or 2. That's their Christmas dinner. Meanwhile, 3 streets away, in a townhouse lit by gas lamps, a middle-class merchant family is preparing their feast. Roast goose, plum pudding, mince pies, wine, brandy, chestnuts roasting on an actual fire in an actual fireplace. The children have received toys. The tree is decorated. Carols are being sung. The poor family can probably smell that Christmas dinner cooking, can probably hear those carols, can see the warm light glowing from those windows. How would that feel? Be honest with yourself. How would you feel sitting with your children, eating oysters on Christmas while knowing that just a few houses away people are feasting? While knowing that all those beautiful Christmas traditions you keep hearing about, the trees, the gifts, the special foods, are happening without you? Would you feel grateful, spiritual, full of Christmas cheer? Or would you feel angry, bitter, forgotten? This is the melancholy beneath the magic. This is the shadow that Victorian Christmas cast, even as it sparkled and grew. And here's what makes it even more painful. The 1840s were when Christmas was being reborn as a holiday centered on children, on family, on joy and abundance. All the new traditions, the tree, the gifts, the special meal, were explicitly about creating happiness for children, about making magical memories. But if you were poor, if you were struggling, all of this cultural emphasis on children's Christmas joy became a form of torture, because you couldn't give your children that magic. You couldn't afford the tree, the gifts, the feast. You had to watch your children's faces on Christmas morning and explain why Father Christmas didn't come to your house. The Victorians tried to solve this through charity. The wealthy and middle classes felt genuine concern for the poor, at least some of them did. Christmas became associated with charitable giving, with providing meals and gifts to those less fortunate. In 1851, a massive charitable event was held in Leicester Square in London. A huge marquee was set up, and over the course of the Christmas season, 22,000 people who were homeless or destitute were fed roast beef pie, plum pudding, porter, tea, and coffee. The marquee was decorated with festive lights and flowers, creating a kind of temporary Christmas wonderland for people who had nothing. This sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Generous, kind-hearted, and it was. The organisers genuinely wanted to help. The people who ate that food were genuinely grateful. But also, can you imagine the humiliation? Having to line up with thousands of other desperate people in a public space to receive charity. Having to admit that you couldn't feed yourself, that you needed the wealthy to save you. There's a reason Charles Dickens' character, Scrooge's attitude toward charity is so chilling. When the charity collectors ask him to donate to help the poor at Christmas, he responds, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" That was a real attitude. Many Victorians believed that poverty was a moral failing, that poor people were lazy, immoral, weak, that if they were struggling, it was their own fault. The workhouses, grim institutions where the destitute could go for food and shelter in exchange for hard labour, were deliberately made miserable to discourage people from seeking help. The thinking went, if the workhouse is horrible enough, people will be motivated to work harder and pull themselves up. They'll only come here as a last resort. But what happens when there's no work to be had? When factories are laying people off? When wages don't cover the cost of living? What happens when you've done everything right, worked hard, stayed sober, lived morally, and you still can't feed your children? In the 1840s, thousands of families faced this reality. And at Christmas, when everyone else was celebrating, when the culture was screaming about joy and abundance and family happiness, the poor felt their poverty more acutely than ever. Food historians have done fascinating research on Victorian working-class Christmas meals. What they've found is heartbreaking. Many families saved all year, putting aside pennies whenever they could, specifically to buy a goose for Christmas. Not a turkey. Turkeys were for the wealthy. Not a beef roast, far too expensive. A goose. One goose for the entire family. And even that was often beyond reach. So communities developed goose clubs. You'd pay a few pennies every week into a communal fund, and at Christmas the club would purchase geese in bulk at a discount, and you'd get your goose. It was like a medieval layaway plan, except for a single meal. Think about that. Spending an entire year saving for one meal. One special meal to make Christmas feel like Christmas. And if the money ran out, if you couldn't make all the payments to the goose club, then you had no goose. You had oysters and stale bread. and you tried to convince your children that this was still special, still Christmas, still enough. The contrast between Victorian Christmas magic and Victorian Christmas melancholy wasn't subtle. It was stark, violent even. The same newspapers that published illustrations of the royal family's Christmas tree also ran stories about children found frozen to death in doorways. The same magazines that printed Christmas card designs also published exposés on the horrific conditions in London's slums. Everyone knew. The wealthy knew. The middle class knew. They couldn't pretend they didn't see the poverty, couldn't claim ignorance. The poor were everywhere, begging on street corners, selling matches or flowers, sleeping under bridges, dying in plain sight. But knowing and caring are different things. Knowing and acting are different things. Some Victorians looked at the hungry 40s and felt their conscience awakened. They increased their charitable giving. They advocated for reform. They wrote books and articles demanding change. Others looked at the same suffering and shrugged. This is the natural order, they said. This is how capitalism works. Some succeed, some fail. That's life. And still others, and this is perhaps the saddest category, simply looked away. They focused on their own Christmas preparations, their own families, their own joy. They didn't want to think about the suffering. It was too uncomfortable. It ruined the holiday spirit. Does any of this sound familiar? In our modern world, we do the same thing. We know there are people struggling, people hungry, people without homes. We see them sometimes, especially during the holidays. We might drop some money in a donation bucket, feel briefly good about ourselves, and then return to our own celebrations. We want the magic without the melancholy. We want to enjoy our abundance without confronting the fact that abundance for some requires scarcity for others. The Victorians were grappling with the same moral tension we face today. In fact, they were the first society to face it at this scale, because they were the first industrial, urban, mass-consumer society. They were inventing not just Christmas traditions, but the entire modern relationship between celebration and social responsibility. And one man was watching all of this. The poverty, the suffering, the contrast between Christmas joy and Christmas despair, and becoming increasingly angry. He was a writer. He was famous. He had a voice that thousands of people listened to. And in late 1843, he decided to use that voice to write something that would shake Victorian England's conscience and change Christmas forever. His name was Charles Dickens, and he was about to create the most famous ghost story ever told, one that would haunt the wealthy and give hope to the poor in ways he couldn't have imagined. October 1843. Charles Dickens is walking through the streets of London at night. Again. He does this often, sometimes 15, sometimes 20 miles in a single evening. His friends think he's eccentric. His wife thinks he's avoiding family life. But Dickens isn't just walking, he's seeing. He sees things most people hurry past. The children sleeping in doorways, their thin bodies pressed together for warmth. The women standing under gas lamps selling matches, flowers, anything to earn a few pennies. The men slumped against walls, too exhausted or too hungry to move. The faces that look at him as he passes, not with hope, but with the blank stare of people who have learned that hope is dangerous. Dickens has been famous for years now. He's wealthy, successful. His novels are bestsellers. He could stay home in his comfortable house, warm by the fire, and never walk these streets. But something won't let him rest. Something is eating at him. He's been thinking about a pamphlet, a serious, sober, analytical pamphlet about poverty and social responsibility. Something important, something forgettable. And then, somewhere between a grimy alley and a shuttered shop, an idea strikes him. not a pamphlet, a story, a ghost story. What if he could make wealthy people feel what he's feeling right now? What if he could scare them into caring? Not with statistics or moral arguments, but with something more visceral, more emotional, more real. He starts composing in his head as he walks. A miser. A man who has everything but feels nothing. Ghosts who force him to see. To really see. By the time Dickens gets home that night, he's practically vibrating with excitement. His sister-in-law will later write that during the composition of this story, Dickens wept and laughed and wept again and excited himself in a most extraordinary manner. The book he's about to write will be called A Christmas Carol, the subtitle, in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. And he has exactly 6 weeks to finish it before Christmas. Now, Dickens is not a slow writer. The man is a machine. He's been producing novels at breakneck speed for years, often writing in monthly installments, always racing deadlines. But even for him, 6 weeks for a complete book is ambitious. He writes during the day. He walks at night, working out scenes in his head. He becomes completely absorbed in the story. His family barely sees him. When they do see him, he's somewhere else mentally, living in Scrooge's world, feeling what Scrooge feels. There's something you should know about Charles Dickens. He had experienced poverty firsthand. When he was 12 years old, his father was thrown into debtor's prison. Charles, just a child, was sent to work in a factory, pasting labels on bottles of boot polish for 10 hours a day. The humiliation, the fear, the sheer exhaustion of being a child forced to work like an adult. It marked him forever. So when Dickens writes about poverty, he's not imagining, he's remembering. He knows what it feels like to be hungry, to be cold, to be powerless, and he knows something else. He was lucky. He escaped. His father was released from prison. Charles got to return to school, to pursue writing, to become successful. But what about the children who don't escape? What about the ones still working in factories, still sleeping in doorways, still trapped in poverty with no way out? This is what drives him as he writes A Christmas Carol. This is why he can't sleep, can't rest, can't think about anything else. The story he creates is deceptively simple. Ebenezer Scrooge, a wealthy miser, is visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve. The ghosts of Christmas past, present and future. They show him his life, who he was, who he is, who he'll become if he doesn't change. By Christmas morning, Scrooge is transformed. He becomes generous, kind, joyful. He saves Tiny Tim. Everyone lives happily ever after. It's a fairy tale, really, the ultimate redemption story. But buried inside this fairy tale is something much darker, much more radical, something that made Victorian readers profoundly uncomfortable, even as they loved the story. It happens when the ghost of Christmas present appears to Scrooge. This ghost is a giant, tall and powerful, dressed in green robes, surrounded by abundance. He represents the spirit of Christmas celebration, of feasting and joy. But there's something hidden beneath his robes. 2 children. Dickens describes them in horrifying detail. Yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. These aren't cute Dickensian urchins with smudged cheeks who just need a good meal. These are creatures, monsters, so degraded by poverty that they barely seem human anymore. Scrooge asks the ghost whose children they are. The ghost responds, "They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom. unless the writing be erased. Read that again. They are man's, not God's children, not unfortunate victims of circumstances, man's children, humanity's responsibility, our creation, our problem, ignorance and want, the two forces that perpetuate poverty. People are poor because they lack education, ignorance, and because they lack basic resources, want. And unless society addresses both, the result will be doom. This isn't a cute Christmas message. This is a threat. Dickens is saying, if you don't fix this, if you don't take responsibility for the poor, something terrible will happen. Social collapse, revolution, doom. Remember, Dickens is writing this in 1843. Just 5 years earlier, in 1838, the Chartist movement, a working-class movement demanding political reform, had erupted across Britain. There were riots, strikes, violence. The wealthy and middle classes were genuinely terrified that the poor might rise up, that there might be a revolution like France had experienced. Dickens is tapping into that fear. He's saying, you think you can ignore the poor? You think you can keep celebrating your comfortable Christmas while children starve? You're creating your own doom. But here's the genius of A Christmas Carol. It's not just a warning. It's an instruction manual. Scrooge doesn't just feel guilty. He doesn't just donate money to charity and go back to his old life. He transforms completely. He becomes a different person. He takes personal responsibility. He doesn't wait for the government or the church or some organization to solve the problem. He acts. And, this is crucial, he doesn't just give money, he gives relationship. He becomes part of Bob Cratchit's family. He becomes personally involved in Tiny Tim's life. He doesn't maintain the distance between rich and poor, he closes it. This was revolutionary. Victorian charity was usually impersonal. You gave money to organizations. You maybe attended a charity event once a year, but you didn't actually interact with poor people as equals. You didn't invite them into your life. Dickens is saying, that's not enough. Real change requires connection, relationship. Seeing poor people not as problems to be solved, but as human beings to be known. The book was published on December 19th, 1843. Dickens had it printed in a small, expensive format. He wanted it to be beautiful, to be a gift-worthy book. It cost 5 shillings, which was a lot for a short novel. He could have priced it cheaper, made it more accessible, but he was targeting the wealthy and middle classes. He wanted the people who could actually do something about poverty to read it. The first edition sold out in days. By Christmas Eve, every copy was gone. The reviews were rapturous. The writer William Makepeace Thackeray called it a national benefit. The poet Thomas Hood wrote, "It was a blessed inspiration that put such a book into the head of Charles Dickens." But the real impact wasn't in the reviews. It was in what people did after reading it. Wealthy industrialists wrote to Dickens telling him they'd been moved to tears, that they were going to treat their workers better. Charity donations spiked. People started seeing Christmas as a time for social responsibility, not just celebration. The phrase, Christmas spirit, began to mean not just joy and festivity, but also generosity and compassion. A Christmas Carol became, as some contemporaries called it, a new gospel, not replacing Christianity, but reinterpreting it, making it relevant to industrial, urban, modern life, saying, faith without action is meaningless. If you claim to be a Christian, if you celebrate Christ's birth, then you must care for the poor, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. Here's something that blows my mind. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 6 weeks, and it has remained continuously in print for over 180 years. There has not been a single Christmas since 1843 when A Christmas Carol wasn't available to read. How many books can you say that about? And the story has been adapted. How many times do you think? Guess before I tell you. Hundreds of times. Maybe thousands. There are film versions, stage versions, television versions, radio versions, musical versions. There are versions with Muppets, with Disney characters, with modern settings, with sci-fi settings. Every generation finds new ways to tell this story because the story still matters. Why? What makes A Christmas Carol so enduring? I think it's because the story offers something we desperately want to believe, that people can change, that even the cruelest, most hardened person can be redeemed, that it's never too late to become better. Scrooge isn't just wealthy and stingy, he's actively cruel. He's mean to children. He mocks people's joy. He tells charity workers that poor people should die and decrease the surplus population. He's essentially a sociopath, and yet, by the end of one night, he's transformed. He becomes the best version of himself. He becomes what he always could have been but chose not to be. That's a fantasy, right? People don't really change that dramatically, that quickly. Real transformation takes time, effort, backsliding, trying again. But maybe we need the fantasy. Maybe we need to believe that change is possible, that redemption is real, that tomorrow can be different from today. Especially at Christmas, when we're taking stock of our lives, thinking about who we've been and who we want to be. Dickens gave us permission to hope, not blind, naive hope that everything will be fine without effort, but hope that if we're willing to really see, really feel, really act, then things can get better. And for a moment in the winter of 1843, it seemed like things were getting better. A Christmas Carol became a sensation. People were talking about social responsibility. Charity increased. The wealthy were, at least temporarily, examining their consciences. But here's what Dickens knew, even as he celebrated his book's success. One story, one burst of generosity, one warm Christmas feeling. It's not enough. Because while wealthy Londoners were reading about Scrooge's redemption by their cosy fires, there were still people sleeping in doorways, still children working in factories, still families choosing between rent and food. And the most brutal institution of all, the one designed explicitly to punish people for being poor, was still operating, still separating families, still grinding people down in the name of helping them. The workhouse, the place Scrooge mentions dismissively, the place he thinks is sufficient charity, the place where poor people went when they had absolutely no other choice, knowing they would be stripped of their dignity, their possessions, their family connections, everything that made them human, in exchange for basic survival. What was Christmas like in a workhouse? What happened when the season of family joy arrived in a place designed to destroy families? That's a story Dickens only hinted at, a darkness even he shied away from fully depicting. But it's a story we need to understand if we're going to grasp the full truth of Victorian Christmas. The gulf between the magic and the melancholy, between Scrooge's redemption and the reality that most people faced. Christmas morning, 1876. An elderly man stands at the gates of a workhouse, staring up at the building. He's spent the entire year working odd jobs, sleeping rough, doing everything possible to avoid this moment. But winter has come, and he's too old, too tired, too cold. He has no choice. He rings the bell, the gate opens, he steps inside, and the moment he does, he stops being a person with a name, with a history, with dignity. He becomes an inmate, a pauper, a problem to be managed. This is what Christmas looked like for hundreds of thousands of Victorian poor. Not trees and gifts and family gatherings, but this, the workhouse. To understand how cruel this system was, and I mean truly, deliberately cruel, we need to go back to 1834. That's when Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, completely restructuring how England dealt with poverty. Before 1834, poor relief was handled locally by each parish. If you were destitute, you could apply for outdoor relief. Basically, the parish would give you some money or food, and you could stay in your home. It wasn't generous, but it was something. It allowed families to stay together. But by the 1830s, the cost of poor relief was skyrocketing. The wealthy taxpayers who funded it were getting angry. They looked at all these poor people receiving assistance and said, "Why should we pay for their laziness? This is encouraging dependency. We need to make poverty so unpleasant that people will do anything to avoid it." So they created a new system. No more outdoor relief. If you wanted help, you had to enter the workhouse. And the workhouse was designed, deliberately, explicitly designed, to be worse than any alternative. The official term was less eligible. Life in the workhouse had to be less desirable than the worst-paying job, the most miserable living conditions outside. Otherwise, people might choose the workhouse instead of working. Think about that logic for a second. The government was saying, "We're going to make this place so horrible that you'll prefer literally anything else, even starvation, even homelessness, rather than come here." And they succeeded. When you arrived at the workhouse, you were stripped. Literally. Your clothes were taken away and either burned or stored. You were washed, forcibly, often in cold water. Your hair was cut short. Women had their hair cropped close to the scalp, which was humiliating in an era when long hair was a crucial part of feminine identity. You were given a uniform made from coarse, scratchy fabric. Everyone wore the same thing. No personal possessions allowed, no dignity, no individuality. And then came the worst part: separation. Families were split up. Men in one wing, women in another, children in a third. Even married couples couldn't stay together. You could live in the same building as your spouse, your children, your parents, and never be allowed to speak to them. Imagine that. You've lost everything. Your home, your possessions, your independence. The only thing you have left is your family, and the workhouse takes that too. Why? Because the administrators believed that if families could stay together, the workhouse wouldn't be sufficiently miserable. People might actually choose to stay. So separation was essential to the system. It was the point. There's a story, a real story, documented in workhouse records, about a woman named Mary who entered a workhouse with her husband John in December 1875. They'd been married for 40 years. They had no children, no other family. They were each other's entire world. The workhouse separated them, placed them in different wings. John tried to sneak across to see Mary. He was caught and punished, locked in a cell, given reduced rations. On Christmas Eve, John found a way to pass a note to Mary. The note said, "Stay strong. We'll be together again someday." Mary died in January. John never saw her again after that Christmas Eve. He died 3 months later. The workhouse officials logged their deaths in the ledger with no comment. Just names, ages, dates. As if these were not two people who had loved each other for 40 years. As if their deaths were not connected. As if this was normal. Now, you might be thinking, surely Christmas was different. Surely they made an exception during the holiday season. Well, yes and no. Initially, in 1834, the Poor Law Commissioners ordered that no extra food was to be given on Christmas Day. It was to be treated like any other day. The regular workhouse diet, which was barely sufficient for survival, would continue unchanged. No feast, no celebration, just another day of grinding, pointless labour. But this policy was so unpopular, so obviously cruel, that by the 1840s most workhouses ignored it. The local guardians, the officials who ran individual workhouses, decided to provide special Christmas meals. And here's where things get complicated. Because these Christmas dinners were both genuine kindness and horrifying patronage at the same time. A typical workhouse Christmas dinner in the 1850s might include roast beef, plum pudding, beer or porter for the adults, oranges for the children. The dining hall would be decorated with greenery, holly and ivy, maybe some ribbon. Sometimes local benefactors would attend, watching the inmates eat, feeling good about their charity. For people who had been eating thin gruel and stale bread for weeks, this meal was incredible. The beef was real meat. The pudding was sweet. The beer made you forget for a moment where you were. But imagine the psychological complexity of this moment. You're sitting in a decorated hall eating good food for the first time in months. You should be grateful, right? You should feel blessed. Except you're wearing a uniform. You're surrounded by strangers. Your spouse is in another room. Your children are somewhere else in the building. You're eating this feast not in your own home, not at your own table, but in an institution that has systematically stripped you of everything that made you human. And the wealthy people who organised this, the guardians, the local donors, they're watching you, smiling, patting themselves on the back for their generosity, talking about how happy the inmates look, how grateful. Do you smile back? Do you perform gratitude? Or do you let your real feelings show, the humiliation, the rage, the bone-deep sadness of eating Christmas dinner in a workhouse? A journalist named George R. Sims watched one of these Christmas dinners in 1877. He was a social reformer who wrote extensively about poverty and working-class life, and what he saw at that workhouse Christmas feast inspired him to write a poem, or really, a dramatic monologue, that became one of the most famous pieces of Victorian literature. It's called Christmas Day in the Workhouse. The poem tells the story of an elderly man who stands up during the Christmas feast and refuses to eat. When the workhouse officials demand to know why, he tells them, exactly 1 year ago, on Christmas Day, his wife died. She died because the relieving officer, the official who decided who deserved help, refused to give them outdoor relief. He said they could enter the workhouse, but the man's wife refused. She said, "I think I can bear the hunger. The other would break my heart." So she stayed home, and she starved to death rather than be separated from her husband. In Sims' poem, the old man looks at the feast and says he cannot eat the food of villains whose hands are foul and red with his wife's blood. The poem ends with him being dragged away for causing a disturbance. Now, this is a dramatic, emotional piece of writing. It's designed to make you feel. But here's what makes it powerful. Stories like this were real. The details might be fictionalized, but the situation, that happened. People did starve rather than enter the workhouse. Families were separated. Spouses died alone. The poem was recited in music halls, published in newspapers, performed in theatres. It became so popular that everyone in Britain knew it. It made Christmas in the workhouse a symbol of cruelty, of injustice, of the gap between what Christmas was supposed to mean and what it actually meant for the poor. But here's what's fascinating and frustrating about Victorian responses to this reality. They didn't change the system. They just tried to make Christmas in the workhouse nicer. By the 1880s and 1890s, workhouse Christmas celebrations became quite elaborate. The Times newspaper published annual reviews of how London area workhouses treated their inmates at Christmas. It became a point of pride for workhouses to report that they'd given extra pudding, extra beer, gifts for the children, entertainment. Some workhouses held Christmas concerts where inmates could perform songs. Some gave out tobacco to the men, snuff to the women. Some decorated the halls so extensively that they looked like middle-class homes. One workhouse in 1890 reported giving each child an orange, some sweets, and a small toy. This sounds lovely, doesn't it? It sounds like progress. But the separation policy remained. The harsh daily routine remained. The humiliation of being an inmate remained. The inability to leave remained. The workhouse was still a prison in all but name. So what were these Christmas celebrations really about? Were they genuine compassion? Or were they a way for Victorian society to ease its conscience without actually addressing the problem? I think they were both, and that's what makes them so morally complex. The people who organise these Christmas dinners, the guardians, the volunteers, the donors, they weren't all hypocrites. Many genuinely cared. They were working within a system they believed was necessary, but they wanted to add moments of kindness where they could. They thought, we can't change the whole system, but we can make Christmas special. And for the inmates, that Christmas dinner might be the only day all year when they had enough to eat, when they felt like human beings instead of problems. That mattered. It genuinely mattered. But it also didn't solve anything. Come December 26th, the families were still separated. The food went back to being minimal. The work went back to being pointless and grinding. Nothing changed. This is the tragedy of Victorian Christmas charity. It was sincere and inadequate at the same time. It made people feel better without making people's lives better. It was a band-aid on a wound that needed surgery. And some people saw this. Some people understood that Christmas kindness wasn't enough, that the whole system needed to be torn down and rebuilt. But those voices were minority voices. Most Victorians wanted to believe that charity could solve poverty, that goodwill could overcome structural injustice. They wanted to believe in Scrooge's transformation, that all it took was a change of heart, a moment of generosity, and everything would be fixed. But real life isn't a Christmas carol. Real change doesn't happen overnight, and good intentions without structural reform just perpetuate the problem while making everyone feel better about it. There's a workhouse record from Christmas 1888 that haunts me. It lists all the inmates, hundreds of them, names, ages, how long they'd been there, and next to many names there's a note. No visitors. No visitors at Christmas. No family came, either because they didn't know where their loved one had ended up, or because they were too ashamed to visit the workhouse, or because they were trapped in their own poverty and couldn't afford the journey. Imagine being in that workhouse, Imagine sitting at the Christmas feast with the decorated hall and the special food and the wealthy visitors smiling at you, and knowing that no one, not one person outside these walls, knows or cares that you're here. That's Victorian Christmas for hundreds of thousands of people. Not magic, not even melancholy, just absence, just forgetting, just institutional care that looked like kindness but felt like abandonment. The workhouse system lasted well into the 20th century. It wasn't fully abolished until 1930. Even after that, many of the buildings were converted into hospitals or nursing homes. And if you talk to elderly people in Britain today, many still remember the stigma, the fear of ending up in the workhouse. The Victorian Christmas celebration we inherited, the trees, the gifts, the family gatherings, the emphasis on joy and abundance, it was built in deliberate contrast to this darkness. It was a response to the workhouse, to poverty, to suffering. The Victorians created Christmas magic because they lived surrounded by Christmas misery. But they made a mistake. They separated the two. They said, here's the magic for us, and here's the charity for them. They didn't imagine a world where everyone could have the magic, where the system itself could be just. And we've inherited that separation. We still live in a world where some people have abundant Christmases while others struggle, where charity provides moments of relief without addressing root causes, where we decorate and celebrate and feel good while other people, often invisible to us, are living through their own version of the workhouse Christmas. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we hold both the magic and the melancholy? How do we celebrate Christmas while acknowledging the darkness beneath it? I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it starts with seeing, really seeing, not looking away, not pretending the darkness doesn't exist because it ruins the mood. The Victorians had one tradition that might help us with this, a tradition that acknowledged darkness explicitly, a tradition that said, Christmas isn't just about light and joy, it's also about ghosts, about the supernatural, about the thin veil between life and death. And gathered by the fire on Christmas Eve, Victorians would tell stories, not of magic and redemption, but of terror and haunting. Stories that would make us understand that winter and Christmas and life itself contain mysteries we can't control, forces we can't tame, truths we'd rather not face. That tradition has been mostly lost, but understanding where it came from, why the Victorians needed ghost stories during their season of celebration, that might be the key to understanding Victorian Christmas itself. Christmas Eve, 1891, a Victorian parlour in London. The curtains are drawn, candles flicker, gas lamps have been turned low deliberately. A family sits in a circle around the fireplace, not to sing carols, not to open presents, but to tell ghost stories. The father clears his throat and begins. It was a dark December night, much like this one, when a traveller came upon an old coaching inn. The children lean forward. The fire crackles. Outside the wind howls. And for the next hour this family will trade stories of phantoms, of curses, of the dead who refuse to stay buried. This is Christmas. Victorian Christmas. If you find that strange, if you're thinking, wait, ghost stories? At Christmas? Isn't that a Halloween thing? Then you're experiencing exactly the cultural shift that happened over the last century. Because for the Victorians, Christmas and ghosts went together like Christmas and candy canes do today. In fact, telling ghost stories was so fundamental to Victorian Christmas that when the humorist Jerome published a book in 1891 called Told After Supper, he opened with this observation: whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. Think about that phrase. Authentic anecdotes about spectres. These weren't just made-up stories. Victorians wanted stories that claimed to be true. Real ghosts, real hauntings, real encounters with the supernatural. But why? Why Christmas specifically? Why did the season of peace on earth and goodwill toward men become the season for tales of terror? The answer goes back thousands of years, long before Christianity, long before Christmas even existed. Winter solstice, December 21st, the shortest day of the year, the longest night. In ancient cultures across Europe, Celtic, Norse, Germanic, this was considered one of the most dangerous times of the year, not because of the cold, though that was dangerous enough, but because of what the darkness meant. Ancient peoples believed that during the darkest days of winter, The veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin. The boundary that normally kept spirits on their side and humans on ours, it weakened. Ghosts could cross over. The dead could walk among us. This belief persisted through centuries, through the Christianization of Europe, through the medieval period. When Christmas was established as our holiday around December 25th, close to the winter solstice, it absorbed many of these older pagan beliefs. The supernatural element didn't disappear. It was baptized, so to speak, reframed but not eliminated. By the time we get to Victorian England, nobody seriously believed in ancient pagan gods anymore. But the association between winter darkness and supernatural danger, that stuck. It was in the culture's bones. And the Victorians, being Victorian, took this ancient tradition and commercialized it, industrialized it, turned it into mass entertainment. Starting in the 1850s, magazines and newspapers began publishing ghost stories specifically for Christmas. This wasn't just any time. This was the time for ghost stories. Publishers would save their best supernatural tales for the Christmas issues. Charles Dickens, yes, him again, edited special Christmas editions of his magazines Household Words and All the Year Round that featured multiple ghost stories. And these weren't gentle, moralistic tales like A Christmas Carol. These were horror stories. Stories meant to genuinely frighten people, to make them pull their blankets tighter, to make them glance nervously at shadows, to make them wonder if that creaking sound was just the house settling or something else. There was The Signal Man by Dickens himself, about a railway worker haunted by a ghost that appears before terrible accidents. There was M.R. James's collection of Christmas ghost stories, featuring malevolent spirits and ancient curses. There were stories about possessed mirrors, cursed jewels, revenants seeking revenge, children who weren't quite human. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine sitting by candlelight on Christmas Eve, reading a story specifically designed to terrify you, and thinking, ah yes, perfect holiday entertainment? But the Victorians didn't just read ghost stories. They believed in ghosts, or at least they wanted to believe. They were desperate to believe. Because the Victorian era was caught in a massive tension between two opposing forces, science and spiritualism. And nowhere was this tension more apparent than at Christmas. On one hand, the Victorian age was the age of reason, of science, of industrial progress. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, fundamentally challenging religious certainty about creation. Railways were connecting the country. Telegraph wires were carrying messages at speeds that would have seemed magical to previous generations. Electricity was being harnessed. The world was being explained, mapped, conquered. The Victorians were proud of their rationality, proud of their progress. They saw themselves as leaving superstition behind, moving toward an enlightened future. But on the other hand, people were dying. Disease, workplace accidents, childbirth complications, childhood illnesses. Life expectancy in Victorian England was about 40 years. People lost children constantly, lost spouses, lost parents. The average Victorian family experienced profound grief multiple times, and the scientific worldview that explained so much, that made telegraphs work and trains run, that worldview had nothing comforting to say about death. Science said, when you die, you're gone. Consciousness ceases. There is no afterlife, no heaven, no reunion with loved ones. Just nothing. For people drowning in grief, this was unbearable, so they turned to spiritualism. The spiritualism movement exploded in Victorian England in the 1850s and 1860s. It claimed that the dead weren't really gone, that through mediums, people with special psychic abilities. You could communicate with spirits. That consciousness survived death. That your lost loved ones were still out there, still aware, still caring about you. And, this is important, spiritualism presented itself as scientific. Mediums didn't just do seances in dark rooms with candles and incense. They conducted experiments. They invited skeptical observers. They claimed to be using natural laws that science simply hadn't discovered yet. They said, just as we discovered electricity and magnetism, we're discovering the laws of spiritual communication. This is why spiritualism appealed to Victorians in a way modern New Age spirituality might not. It promised to reconcile the two things they desperately wanted to believe in: scientific progress and life after death. It said, you don't have to choose, you can have both. And Christmas was the perfect time for seances. Remember that thin veil between worlds? Christmas Eve in particular was considered a powerful night for spiritual communication. The ghosts were already more active. The boundary was already weak. A skilled medium, under the right conditions, could bridge that gap. So Victorian families, respectable, middle-class, church-going families, would hold seances on Christmas Eve. They'd sit around a table, hold hands, dim the lights, and invite the dead to join their Christmas celebration. Sometimes they tried to contact recently deceased relatives. Sometimes they sought messages from famous historical figures. Sometimes they just wanted proof, any proof, that death wasn't the end. What happened at these seances? Well, that depends on who you ask. Believers reported astonishing phenomena. Tables levitating, mysterious knocks answering questions, voices speaking in the darkness, spirits manifesting in clouds of ectoplasm, automatic writing where spirits guided the medium's hand to write messages. Skeptics reported fraud, mediums using tricks, accomplices hiding in cabinets, phosphorescent paint creating fake ghosts, simple ventriloquism, and cold reading making gullible people think they were hearing from the dead. The truth? Probably both. Some mediums were genuine believers who thought they had special abilities. Others were con artists who saw a profitable business opportunity. And the seance participants themselves. They wanted so badly to believe that they often ignored obvious signs of trickery. But here's what's fascinating. Even the skeptics participated. Even people who thought it was probably nonsense would still attend a Christmas Eve seance. Because what if? What if it was real? What if you could hear your dead child's voice one more time? What if you could tell your deceased spouse that you still loved them? Hope is a powerful thing. Even desperate, probably false hope. The most famous spiritualist of the Victorian era was a man you might know. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, that paragon of cold logic and rational deduction. Conan Doyle was a passionate believer in spiritualism, especially after he lost his son in World War I. He attended seances. He wrote books defending spiritualism. He got into bitter public arguments with skeptics who claimed mediums were frauds. And he specifically wrote and promoted Christmas ghost stories, seeing them as a way to keep people open to spiritual possibilities. Think about that irony. The man who created literature's most famous rational detective was also one of the most prominent believers in talking to the dead. This is the Victorian paradox. This is why they needed ghost stories at Christmas. Because Christmas itself embodied their central tension. It was about birth and death, presence and absence, what you can see and what you must believe without seeing. Every Victorian Christmas had an empty chair. Someone who should have been there but wasn't. A child who died of scarlet fever. A spouse who died in childbirth. A parent who died of tuberculosis. The middle-class Victorian family gathered around their beautiful Christmas tree, opening their gifts, eating their feast, and they were acutely aware of who was missing. Ghost stories acknowledged that absence. They said, "The dead are still here in a way. They're not at the table, but they're not gone either. They're in the shadows, in the memories, in the stories we tell. And maybe, just maybe, if we tell the right story, in the right way, on the right night, we might feel them close to us again." There's a line in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale where a character says, "A sad tale's best for winter." The Victorians understood this deeply. They knew that forcing relentless cheerfulness, pretending everything was fine, denying the darkness, that didn't work. That made the grief worse. But acknowledging the darkness, telling sad tales, inviting the ghost to the Christmas gathering, that was honest. That was real. That honoured what they'd lost while still celebrating what remained. Modern Christmas has mostly lost this. We've sanitised the holiday, made it all about joy and light and positive thinking. We're supposed to be happy at Christmas. If you're sad, if you're grieving, if you're missing someone, well, you're doing Christmas wrong. The Victorians would have found this attitude bizarre, cruel even. They understood that Christmas contains multitudes, that you can be joyful and grieving simultaneously, that the light means more when you acknowledge the dark. This is why the ghost story tradition mattered. It created space for complexity, for ambivalence, for the uncomfortable truth that not everyone's Christmas is merry. But in America, the ghost story tradition never really took hold. Americans read A Christmas Carol. They liked it. But the broader tradition of Christmas ghost stories, of seances on Christmas Eve, of embracing the supernatural during the holidays, that never became part of American culture. Why not? Historians have several theories. One is that America, as a relatively young nation founded on Enlightenment principles, was more committed to rationality and less comfortable with old superstitions. Another is that Halloween, brought by Irish and Scottish immigrants, became America's designated spooky holiday, making it redundant to have another one at Christmas. But I think there's a deeper reason. America wanted Christmas to be purely positive. America was the land of opportunity, of progress, of optimism. Americans didn't want to acknowledge that maybe progress had costs, that maybe not everyone was thriving, that maybe the modern world left people feeling haunted and displaced. Victorian England couldn't avoid that acknowledgement. The poverty was too visible. The social change was too dramatic. The grief was too overwhelming. So they built darkness into their Christmas celebration. They said, yes, there's magic, but there's also melancholy. Both are true. Both matter. Today, if you mention Christmas ghost stories to most Americans, they'll look at you confused. Maybe someone will remember that line from It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year. There'll be scary ghost stories. And wonder where that came from. It came from the Victorians, from their need to hold light and darkness together, from their understanding that Christmas, like life itself, contains both joy and sorrow, presence and absence, what we can touch and what we can only hope for. The seances have stopped. The magazine ghost story issues have ended. But the need to acknowledge what we've lost, the need to feel connected to those who aren't here anymore, that hasn't changed. We just express it differently now. We look at old photos. We tell stories about people who've died. We say this was Mum's favourite Christmas song, or Dad always carved the turkey. We keep the dead present through memory, through ritual, through storytelling. Maybe that's what ghost stories always were. Not literal belief in the supernatural, but metaphorical understanding that the past isn't past, that the dead aren't fully gone, that love continues beyond the grave. The Victorians, in their peculiar way, were wiser than we are. They didn't separate the happy and sad parts of life into different boxes. They mixed them together. They sang carols and told ghost stories. They decorated trees and visited cemeteries. They celebrated birth and acknowledged death. Both. Always both. And as Victorian Christmas evolved through the decades, as the tradition solidified and spread, there was one element that tied everything together. One ritual that could be both joyful and melancholy, both communal and personal, both ancient and modern. Music. Specifically, the revival of old carols and the creation of new ones, the sound of voices raised together in the darkness, singing about hope and wonder and things that transcend the everyday world. That's where we need to go next. There's a sound that's been lost, a sound we can read about in Victorian diaries and letters, but can't quite imagine anymore. The sound of human voices, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them, rising together in the cold night air, unaccompanied by instruments singing in the darkness. No recorded music playing in the background, no amplification, no way to adjust the volume or skip to the next song. Just people standing together, breathing the same cold air, singing the same words, creating something that existed only in that moment and then vanished forever. This was caroling, real caroling, Victorian caroling, and it almost didn't exist. In fact, by the 1830s, Christmas carols were nearly extinct. Here's what most people don't realise. Those carols you've been singing your entire life, Good King Wenceslas, The First Noel, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. By 1830, almost nobody in England knew them. They weren't being sung in churches. They weren't being taught to children. They were dying, disappearing, being forgotten. Remember Oliver Cromwell banning Christmas? Remember that 100-year gap when Christmas barely existed? The carols died during that time, and even after Christmas came back, the carols didn't really recover. By the early 1800s, carol singing had degenerated into something, let's call it problematic. Groups of poor people would go door to door singing, badly, basically as an aggressive form of begging. They weren't celebrating. They were demanding payment for stopping the noise. Respectable middle-class people found this obnoxious. They started shutting their doors, refusing to participate. Carol singing became associated with drunkenness, disorder, the lower classes, something to be avoided, not celebrated. In the cities, especially London, caroling was essentially extinct by 1830. If you wanted to hear Christmas music, you might catch a performance at a theatre or a church service. But spontaneous community singing, door-to-door caroling, dead. Except not quite everywhere. In the rural areas, in small villages far from London, in the countryside where industrialisation hadn't yet reached, some people still remembered the old carols. Grandmothers taught them to grandchildren. Farmers sang them while working. They survived, barely, in scattered pockets of memory. And in 1833, a man named William Sandys realised that if someone didn't write these songs down soon, they'd be lost forever. Sandys was a lawyer, but his real passion was antiquarianism, collecting and preserving old traditions before they disappeared. He'd heard rumours of ancient Christmas carols still being sung in remote villages, so he did something remarkable. He went looking for them. Picture this. Sandys travelling through the English countryside, village to village, asking elderly residents, "Do you remember any Christmas songs from when you were young?" Most people looked at him like he was crazy. Christmas songs. What Christmas songs? But occasionally someone would remember. An old woman would sing a few verses her grandmother had taught her. A retired farmer would hum a melody from his childhood. Sandys would write it all down, the words, the music, every detail he could capture. He travelled to the Midlands, to the north of England, to Wales, places where time moved slower, where the old ways hadn't been completely erased, and slowly, painstakingly, he collected them. Songs that were hundreds of years old, medieval carols, Tudor carols, fragments of England's lost Christmas tradition. In 1833, Sandys published Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern. It contained over 100 carols, many of which hadn't been in print for centuries. This book didn't become a bestseller. Most people ignored it, but it did something crucial. It preserved these songs. It kept them from disappearing completely. And then, a decade later, when Christmas started becoming popular again, when Prince Albert's tree caught on, when Dickens published A Christmas Carol, when the Victorians began reinventing Christmas, suddenly there was a hunger for traditional Christmas music, and Sandys' book was there, ready to supply it. Other collectors followed Sandys' example. A man named Davies Gilbert published 2 collections of carols. In 1871, 2 more collectors, Henry Ramsden Bramley and Sir John Stainer, published Christmas Carols New and Old, which became hugely popular and established many carols we still sing today. But here's the fascinating thing. These Victorian collectors didn't just preserve old carols, they changed them, updated them, made them suitable for respectable Victorian parlors and churches. Medieval carols were often bawdy, folk songs filled with double meanings and peasant humour. Victorian editors cleaned them up, removed the earthiness, made them more refined, more spiritual, more appropriate for mixed company and family gatherings. They also wrote entirely new carols, often setting them to old melodies, or creating new melodies in an old style. These Victorian carols tried to sound ancient, tried to feel traditional, even though they were completely new compositions. Take Good King Wenceslas. That was written in 1853 by John Mason Neale. He took an ancient melody, a spring dance tune from the 1200s, and wrote completely new words about a medieval king trudging through snow to help a poor man. It sounds traditional, it feels ancient, but it's Victorian fan fiction, essentially. A Victorian man's imagination of what medieval Christmas charity looked like, and it worked. Good King Wenceslas became one of the most beloved carols in England. Today, most people assume it's been around forever. That's how good the Victorians were at inventing tradition. O Little Town of Bethlehem, written in 1868 by Phillips Brooks, an American Episcopal priest. Away in a Manger, composed around 1885. It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, 1849. Most of the carols we think of as timeless Christmas traditions, they're Victorian. They're about 150 to 170 years old, which in the scheme of Christian history, 2,000 years, is remarkably recent. But the Victorians didn't just write carols, they transformed how carols were sung. They took what had been a rowdy, disorganized, sometimes threatening activity and turned it into respectable family entertainment. Middle-class Victorian homes typically had a piano or an organ. After Christmas dinner, families would gather around the instrument, someone would play, and everyone would sing. This became the new model for caroling, not drunken beggars harassing people on the streets, but refined family music-making in the parlour. And this changed what carols sounded like. They needed to be singable by amateurs, not too complex, not too high or too low, pleasant harmonies that people could pick up easily. The Victorian carol was designed for maximum accessibility and minimum challenge, which, let's be honest, is why we can still sing them today. Most of us aren't trained vocalists, but we can handle Silent Night. We can manage Hark the Herald Angels Sing. The Victorians made Christmas music democratic, something everyone could participate in regardless of skill level. But there was one older tradition that the Victorians preserved with more authenticity: wassailing. Have you ever wondered what wassail means? The word comes from Old Norse, ves heil, meaning be in good health. It was a toast, a blessing. And wassailing was the practice of going door to door, singing songs and being offered a drink from the wassail bowl, a hot, spiced beverage, usually made with ale or cider, apples, sugar, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. The songs associated with wassailing are different from religious carols. They're secular, festive, often demanding. We Wish You a Merry Christmas is actually a wassailing song. Listen to the lyrics. Now bring us some figgy pudding. We won't go until we get some. That's not a request. That's a cheerful threat. Here we come, a wassailing is even more explicit. We're not daily beggars that beg from door to door, but we're neighbours' children whom you've seen before. Love and joy come to you, and God bless you, and send you a happy new year, and God send you a happy new year. Good master and good mistress, as you sit beside the fire, pray think of us poor children who wander in the mire. It's simultaneously blessing and guilt trip. We're not beggars, but we are children wandering in the mire, so maybe share some of that food and drink you're enjoying by your warm fire. Victorian wassailing parties became quite sophisticated. Groups of young people, usually from the same social class, would organise carolling expeditions. They'd dress up warmly, carry lanterns, and walk through neighbourhoods singing at each house. The homeowners were expected to invite them in for refreshments, mince pies, cake, and of course, wassail. This was social currency. If you didn't participate, if you didn't open your door to wassailers or didn't join a wassailing group yourself, you were marking yourself as antisocial, stingy, un-Christmas-like. Wassailing became a way communities reinforce social bonds and expectations. But there was another group doing the carolling, the waits. These were professional or semi-professional musicians licensed by the town, who had the official right to perform on the streets during the Christmas season. They'd play instruments, violins, flutes, horns, and sing carols, collecting money from passers-by and from wealthy patrons. The waits were important because they gave legitimacy to street carolling. They showed that music in public spaces could be respectable, regulated, sanctioned. If the official waits could sing carols on street corners, then maybe carolling wasn't just for beggars and drunks anymore. By the 1860s and 1870s, carol singing had completely transformed. It was everywhere, in churches, where the first official carol service was held at Truro Cathedral in Cornwall in 1880, in homes, around pianos, on streets, with organised groups, in schools, teaching children the recovered ancient carols and the newly composed Victorian ones, and the Industrial Revolution helped. Musical instruments became cheaper due to mass production. Sheet music could be printed inexpensively and distributed widely. The railway system meant that trends and songs could spread across the country rapidly. What was being sung in London one week might reach remote villages within a month. But I want to tell you about one carol that carries within it the entire story of Victorian Christmas, both the magic and the melancholy. A carol that was written not from joy, but from profound grief and despair. December 1863. America is tearing itself apart in civil war. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is sitting in his study, utterly broken. 2 years earlier, his wife Frances died in a horrific accident. Her dress caught fire, accounts vary on exactly how, and she burned to death. Longfellow tried desperately to save her, wrapping her in a rug, burning his own hands and face so badly that he couldn't attend her funeral. He grew a beard to hide the scars. Now, in December 1863, Longfellow has just learned that his eldest son Charles, who ran away to join the Union Army against his father's wishes, has been severely wounded in battle. The boy might die. Longfellow doesn't know. So on Christmas Day 1863, Longfellow is sitting in his house, in a country at war, mourning his dead wife, terrified for his dying son, and he hears the church bells ringing. Christmas bells, celebrating the birth of Christ, proclaiming peace on earth, goodwill to men. And he thinks, what peace? What goodwill? The country is slaughtering itself. My wife is dead. My son is bleeding on a battlefield. Where is the peace? But the bells keep ringing, and he picks up a pen and writes, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And then from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound, the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. He continues, his despair deepening, and in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong, and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. But then, and this is the crucial turn, he writes, then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. The bells don't stop ringing just because he's in despair. The carol doesn't cease just because he doesn't feel it. The promise of peace exists independent of whether he believes in it in this moment. This poem became the carol I heard the bells on Christmas Day, and it's the most honest Victorian Christmas carol ever written. It doesn't pretend grief doesn't exist. It doesn't hide suffering behind forced cheerfulness. It says, yes, everything is terrible. Yes, I'm broken. Yes, peace seems impossible, but the bells keep ringing anyway. This is what Victorian carols at their best could do. They could hold both truths simultaneously, the magic and the melancholy, the hope and the despair, the declaration of peace in the midst of war. Think about that the next time you sing a Christmas carol. You're participating in a tradition that the Victorians saved from extinction and transformed into something both ancient and modern. You're performing songs that claim to be hundreds of years old but are mostly Victorian inventions. You're part of a community ritual that exists precisely because someone in the 1830s decided these songs were too important to let die. And when you sing those carols, even if you're not particularly religious, even if you don't believe the literal content, you're doing something profound. You're connecting your voice with millions of other voices across time and space. You're participating in something bigger than yourself. You're affirming that beauty and hope can exist even in darkness. The Victorians understood this power of communal singing. They knew that when people sang together, something happened that transcended the individual. A connection formed. A temporary community emerged. For those few minutes, everyone was united in creating something beautiful. And that brings us to the heart of Victorian Christmas, the moment when all these traditions came together. When the tree was decorated, the cards were sent, the carols were sung, and the family gathered around one specific ritual that symbolized abundance, generosity, and the vast gulf between those who had everything and those who had nothing. The Christmas feast. The food on the table that revealed everything about who you were and where you belonged in Victorian society. Imagine you can smell it before you see it. That's how the Cratchit children know their Christmas goose is coming home. They're standing on the street corner, outside a building that's warm and bright despite the December cold. It's a bakery. but not just any bakery. On Christmas Day, it transforms into something else entirely. A communal kitchen where hundreds of families bring their raw dinners to be cooked in the massive brick ovens that, on ordinary days, bake bread. Peter Cratchit and his 2 younger siblings are waiting their turn. They've been standing here for maybe 20 minutes, watching other families collect their dinners. A man emerges carrying a steaming joint of beef. A woman carefully cradles a pie. And finally, it's their turn. The baker's assistant brings out their goose. It's not a huge bird. Geese for poor families never are. But it's theirs. The family has saved for it, sacrificed for it, and now, roasted to golden perfection in the baker's oven, it represents everything Christmas is supposed to be. This scene from A Christmas Carol is one of the most famous in all of Victorian literature. But here's what most people don't realise. It's also documentary. Dickens isn't inventing this detail about the bakehouse. He's reporting it. This was real. This was how Christmas dinner worked for thousands of London families. Because here's a fact that should blow your mind. Most working-class Victorian families didn't have ovens. Let that sink in for a moment. No oven. Maybe a single fireplace where you could boil water or heat soup. Maybe not even that. Just a small grate for a coal fire that provided heat but wasn't suitable for cooking. In the cramped, poorly designed tenement buildings where workers lived, space for a proper kitchen was an impossible luxury. So how do you roast a goose without an oven? You don't. You take it to someone who has one. Victorian bakers, recognising a business opportunity, opened their ovens on Christmas Day. For a small fee, usually about 6pence, you could bring your raw dinner and they'd cook it in their commercial ovens alongside dozens of other families' meals. The logistics of this are fascinating. The baker would need some way to identify whose goose was whose beef belonged to which family. Sometimes they used tags. Sometimes they relied on memory and the distinctive pans or dishes people brought. Sometimes they got it wrong and families went home with someone else's dinner. Can you imagine the anxiety? You've spent months saving for this goose. Maybe you joined a goose club, paying in a few pennies every week. Maybe you sacrificed other meals all year to afford this one special dinner, and now you're trusting a baker, a stranger, not to lose it, not to burn it, not to mix it up with someone else's. But mostly, it worked. The bakehouse system was an invisible infrastructure of Christmas, supporting thousands of families who otherwise couldn't have roasted dinners at all. Now, you might be wondering, why a goose? Why not turkey, which we think of as the traditional Christmas bird? Well, turkeys were exotic. They'd been brought to England from America in the 1500s, but they remained expensive, a luxury item for the wealthy and upper middle classes. A turkey in Victorian England cost about twice as much as a goose. For a working-class family, that price difference was insurmountable. Geese were the democratic Christmas bird. They were raised locally, they were available in markets, and they were barely affordable if you planned ahead. They became so associated with working-class Christmas that when Dickens wanted to show Scrooge's transformation, he doesn't just send the Cratchits a bigger goose, he sends them a turkey, the biggest turkey in the shop. It's not just more food, it's a complete elevation in social class, accomplished through poultry. But even geese were beyond many families' reach. Those people ate beef, the cheapest cuts they could find, or mutton, or just vegetables and bread with maybe a little cheese. The Christmas dinner you could afford was a precise measure of your social status, and for the wealthy, the wealthy had something entirely different. An upper-class Victorian Christmas dinner wasn't a meal, it was a production. multiple courses spread over several hours, servants bringing dish after dish, a culinary display of wealth and refinement. The centerpiece might be a massive turkey, but not just a turkey stuffed with a duck, stuffed with a chicken, each layer bringing different flavors and textures, or perhaps a boar's head, an ancient medieval tradition that wealthy Victorians loved to revive as a demonstration of their connection to England's grand past. The boar's head would be presented on a silver platter, garnished elaborately, often with an apple or lemon in its mouth. It was terrifying and magnificent, pure theatre. At Queen's College, Oxford, they still carry on this tradition today, presenting the boar's head on the same silver platter they've used since 1668. But the boar's head was just the dramatic start. After that came soup, usually mulligatawny or turtle soup, then fish, perhaps salmon or oysters, which remember were cheap enough that even the poor ate them, but prepared differently for the wealthy. Then multiple meat courses, the turkey, yes, but also roast beef, venison if you had aristocratic connections, game birds like pheasant or grouse. Side dishes included roasted potatoes, parsnips, Brussels sprouts, carrots. Sauces, bread sauce for the turkey, cranberry sauce, gravy, and of course, mince pies. Now, mince pies are interesting. Today they're small, sweet pastries filled with dried fruits and spices. But originally, centuries before the Victorian era, they actually contained meat. Minced beef or mutton mixed with fruits and spices. By Victorian times, most mince pies had transitioned to being meatless, but they kept the name and the association with Christmas. Why were mince pies so important? Because they were symbolic. Legend said that mince pies should be made with 13 ingredients, representing Christ and the 12 apostles. The spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, represented the gifts of the Magi. Eating a mince pie was a way of literally consuming the Christmas story. And there was a superstition. If you ate a mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th, you'd have 12 months of good luck. So wealthy families would prepare dozens of small mince pies, ensuring they had enough for the full 12 days of celebration. But the real showstopper, the dish that absolutely had to appear on every Victorian Christmas table, rich or poor, was the Christmas pudding. Oh, the Christmas pudding. Let me tell you about this monstrosity of deliciousness. First, understand that Victorian Christmas pudding was not like modern Christmas pudding, which is relatively light and cake-like. Victorian Christmas pudding was dense, heavy, almost weaponizably solid. It was made with suet, beef fat, flour, breadcrumbs, eggs, dried fruits, raisins, currants, candied peel, spices, sugar, and brandy or ale. Lots of everything. The mixture was so thick you could barely stir it. And stir it you must, because there was a tradition called Stir Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, usually in late November. That's when families would make their Christmas pudding. Everyone in the household had to take a turn stirring the pudding mixture. You had to stir from east to west, representing the journey of the Magi. You had to make a wish while stirring. Children were especially excited about this because small silver coins, 3p or 6p pieces, would be hidden in the pudding, and whoever found one in their slice on Christmas Day would have good luck and keep the coin. Once mixed, the pudding was wrapped in cloth and boiled. For hours, sometimes for 8 or 9 hours, with more water added to the pot as it evaporated. The kitchen would be filled with steam, the windows fogged, the smell of spices and fruit and cooking fat permeating everything. Then the pudding would be stored, hung from a hook in a cool place, aging for weeks until Christmas. On Christmas Day it would be boiled again to reheat it, then carried ceremoniously to the table, often doused in brandy and set aflame. The blue flames dancing across the dark pudding surface created a magical moment, literally bringing fire and light to the darkest time of year. Dickens describes Mrs. Cratchit's pudding in A Christmas Carol with a level of anxiety that's both comic and deeply real. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. These weren't idle fears. Puddings did break. They did fail. And for a family that could barely afford the ingredients, a failed pudding was a disaster. It wasn't just food, it was proof of your ability to participate in Christmas properly. A good pudding meant you belonged. A failed one meant, well, it meant you'd failed at Christmas. When Mrs. Cratchit's pudding emerges successfully, Dickens describes it as like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy. That phrase, speckled cannonball, is perfect. Victorian Christmas pudding was ammunition, dense enough to be dangerous. But here's what gets me about the Christmas pudding tradition. It required planning, foresight, resources. You couldn't make a Christmas pudding on December 24th. You needed weeks of preparation, ingredients that had to be purchased gradually, space to store it while it aged. For poor families, this was almost impossible. They might manage a small pudding made with cheaper ingredients, fewer fruits and spices. But the elaborate puddings described in Victorian literature and cookbooks, those were middle class and above. And yet, the cultural expectation was that everyone would have Christmas pudding. It was non-negotiable. So families struggled, sacrificed, went without other things to afford the ingredients. Because not having Christmas pudding meant admitting you were too poor to do Christmas right. Do you see the cruelty in this? The way Victorian Christmas created these mandatory rituals that required money most people didn't have. It wasn't enough to survive. You had to perform abundance. You had to demonstrate that you could participate in middle-class Christmas traditions, even if you were barely scraping by. And nowhere was this performance more visible than in the Christmas stocking. The tradition of hanging stockings for Father Christmas or Santa Claus to fill with gifts was gaining popularity in the Victorian era. We'll talk more about that mythological figure in a moment. But what went into those stockings revealed everything about a family's economic status. A wealthy child's stocking might contain a small toy, sweets, an orange, which was exotic and expensive, nuts, a silver coin, maybe a small book. A middle-class child's stocking might have an orange, nuts, a few sweets, maybe a small inexpensive toy. A poor child's stocking, if they had one at all, contained an apple, an orange if they were very lucky, a few nuts. That's it. An apple, an orange, and nuts. That's what Christmas looked like for millions of Victorian children. Not nothing. These were treats they wouldn't normally have. But compared to what their wealthier counterparts received, compared to what all the Christmas literature described as normal, it was heartbreakingly modest. And the parents giving these stockings, they knew. They knew their children would go to school after Christmas and hear about other children's gifts. They knew their simple offerings would be implicitly judged, found wanting. They gave what they could and hoped it would be enough. Food at Victorian Christmas was never just food. It was language. It was communication. It was a way of saying, this is who we are. This is where we belong in society. This is how successfully we can perform the ritual. When you sat down at a Christmas table, whether that table groaned under the weight of multiple courses or held just a small goose and some potatoes, You were making a statement. You were claiming a position in the social hierarchy. You were demonstrating whether you'd succeeded or failed at being Victorian. And this is where the Industrial Revolution's cruelty becomes most apparent. Because those spices in your Christmas pudding, the cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, those came from Britain's colonies, India, the Caribbean, the East Indies. They were products of empire, of exploitation, of global trade networks built on violence and oppression. The sugar in your mince pies, likely produced by enslaved people in the Caribbean, the tea you drank with your Christmas cake, grown by labourers in India and Ceylon under brutal colonial conditions. Victorian Christmas abundance was built on global suffering. The magical feast in English homes was connected, directly, undeniably, to plantation slavery, colonial extraction, and imperial violence. The Victorians generally didn't think about this connection. They just enjoyed their Christmas dinner and felt grateful for their prosperity. But some people saw it. Some people understood. Social reformers and anti-colonial activists pointed out that British Christmas luxury came at tremendous human cost. They asked uncomfortable questions. How can you celebrate the birth of Christ while profiting from slavery? How can you preach about charity while your wealth is built on exploitation? These questions didn't get much traction during the Victorian era. People didn't want to think about the dark origins of their Christmas feast. They wanted the magic without the melancholy, the celebration without the guilt. But the questions remained, and remain still actually. Our modern Christmas, with its abundance, its global supply chains, its reliance on cheap labour in distant countries, isn't so different from the Victorian model. We've just gotten better at hiding the connections. As Victorian Christmas dinner ended, the pudding eaten, the table cleared, everyone warm and full, there was one more tradition to fulfill, one more figure to acknowledge, a mysterious visitor who rewarded good children and punished bad ones, who travelled impossibly far in a single night, who somehow knew whether you'd been naughty or nice. But who was he really? Where did he come from? And how did the Victorians transform two completely different legendary figures, one English, one Dutch, into the Santa Claus we know today? That story is stranger and more revealing than you might imagine. Close your eyes and picture Santa Claus. What do you see? Red suit, white beard, jolly belly, ho ho ho. He lives at the North Pole. He flies in a sleigh pulled by reindeer. He comes down chimneys. He brings presents to good children on Christmas Eve. Now let me tell you something that might surprise you. That figure, the one you just pictured, didn't exist in the Victorian era. At least, not at the beginning. Instead, Victorian England had Father Christmas, and he was different. Father Christmas was tall and thin. He wore green robes, not red, sometimes brown. He had a crown of holly on his head. He didn't live at the North Pole. He didn't live anywhere specific. He simply appeared during the Christmas season, embodying the spirit of feasting, drinking, and merriment. And here's the crucial difference. Father Christmas didn't bring presents to children. That wasn't his job. He was the personification of Christmas celebration itself. He represented the holiday's permission to feast, to drink, to take a break from work, to be merry. He was less a person and more a concept, the spirit of the season given human form. You can find references to Father Christmas going back to the 1400s in English literature. He appears in medieval carols and Tudor plays, always associated with celebration and abundance. During those 12 days of Christmas festivities we talked about earlier, the wild medieval parties, Father Christmas was the symbolic host, the justification for all that excess. When the Puritans banned Christmas in 1647, they were effectively killing Father Christmas. And when Christmas slowly came back after 1660, Father Christmas returned too, but weakened, uncertain, no longer the powerful figure he'd once been. By the Victorian era, Father Christmas was a nostalgic memory, something grandparents told stories about. He appeared in Christmas pageants and plays representing the old ways of celebrating, but he wasn't a figure that children believed in or expected to visit them. He was more like the spirit of Thanksgiving, if Thanksgiving were a person. Symbolic, not literal. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean and across the North Sea, there was someone else entirely. Someone with a very different origin story and a very different purpose, St. Nicholas. The real St. Nicholas was a Christian bishop who lived in the 4th century in what's now Turkey. According to legend, he was incredibly generous, especially to children and the poor. The most famous story about him involves 3 daughters of a poor man who couldn't afford dowries for them. Without dowries, they couldn't marry, and they'd likely end up being sold into slavery or prostitution. St. Nicholas, hearing about this family's plight, secretly threw bags of gold through their window on 3 successive nights, providing the dowries and saving the daughters. In some versions of the story, he throws the gold down the chimney and it lands in stockings or shoes drying by the fire. That's supposedly where the tradition of stockings by the fireplace comes from. St. Nicholas died on December 6th, and that became his feast day in the Christian calendar. In many European countries, particularly in the Netherlands, Belgium and parts of Germany, St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, became a major holiday, especially for children. St. Nicholas, or Sinterklaas in Dutch, would visit homes and leave gifts for good children and switches or coal for bad ones. When Dutch settlers came to America in the 1600s and 1700s, establishing New Amsterdam, which later became New York, they brought Sinterklaas with them. But in America, something interesting happened. The Dutch tradition started blending with English Christmas traditions. December the 6th was too close to December 25th to maintain as a separate holiday, so the two started merging. And then, in 1823, something happened that would change everything. A man named Clement Clark Moore, a professor of Oriental and Greek literature in New York, wrote a poem for his children. He called it A Visit from St. Nicholas, though it's better known today by its opening line, "'Twas the night before Christmas." Moore probably didn't intend for anyone outside his family to read this poem, but a family friend was so charmed by it that she submitted it anonymously to a newspaper. It was published on December 23, 1823, in the Troy Sentinel in New York, and it went viral. Victorian-style viral, which meant being reprinted in newspaper after newspaper, passed around in handwritten copies, memorized and recited in parlors and schools. Within 20 years, nearly everyone in America knew this poem. What Moore did, whether he realized it or not, was create a completely new character by blending elements from different traditions and adding his own imagination. His saint, Nicholas, is described as chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf. He has a beard as white as the snow. He smokes a pipe, he wears fur, he laughs, ho ho ho. He flies in a miniature sleigh pulled by 8 tiny reindeer, which Moore names for the first time: Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder, and Blitzen. He comes on Christmas Eve, not December the 6th. He enters through the chimney. He fills stockings with toys. He knows who's been naughty or nice. He puts his finger aside his nose and gives a nod, then disappears up the chimney. This is not St. Nicholas of Turkey. This is not Sinterklaas of Holland. This is not Father Christmas of England. This is something new, an American invention that would eventually conquer the world. But notice what Moore's poem doesn't describe. What St. Nicholas looks like beyond being chubby and bearded. What colour are his clothes? The poem doesn't say. Does he wear red, green, blue? That detail was left open. Enter Thomas Nast. Nast was a German-American illustrator and political cartoonist, hugely influential in the second half of the 1800s. And starting in 1863, he began drawing Santa Claus for Harper's Weekly magazine, creating annual Christmas illustrations that ran for 30 years. Nast's Santa Claus was based on Moore's poem, but Nast filled in the visual details. He drew Santa as a large, jolly man with a white beard and a fur-trimmed coat. He showed Santa in his workshop at the North Pole, Nast's invention, surrounded by toys. He depicted elves helping Santa, also Nast's creation. He showed Santa checking his list of naughty and nice children. And here's the detail everyone gets wrong. Nast usually drew Santa in red. Not always. Sometimes brown, sometimes tan, but often red. This was decades before Coca-Cola existed. The idea that Coca-Cola invented the red-suited Santa Claus is one of the most persistent myths in Christmas history. Coca-Cola's 1930s advertising campaign featuring Santa drinking Coke certainly popularized a specific version of a red-suited Santa, but they didn't invent it. Nast had been drawing red-suited Santas since the 1860s. Why red? Possibly because bishops, like the original St. Nicholas, wore red robes. Possibly because red was a festive, eye-catching colour that reproduced well in printing. Possibly because Nast liked how it looked. We don't know for certain, but by the 1880s and 1890s, this American Santa Claus figure, the one from Moore's poem and Nast's illustrations, had become dominant in America, and it started spreading back across the Atlantic to England, which created a problem, because England already had Father Christmas. What happens when two Christmas figures meet? Initially, Victorians tried to maintain the distinction. Father Christmas was the English tradition, the spirit of Christmas celebration, wearing green or brown, representing Old English custom. Santa Claus was the American import, the gift-bringer in red, with his North Pole workshop and flying reindeer. But practically speaking, this distinction was impossible to maintain. Children didn't care about the historical or cultural differences. They just knew there was a magical figure associated with Christmas who brought presents. Whether you called him Father Christmas or Santa Claus didn't matter as much as what he represented. The possibility of generosity, the reward for good behaviour, the magic of Christmas morning. So gradually, over the late Victorian period and into the early 1900s, the two figures merged. Father Christmas absorbed Santa Claus's characteristics, the red suit, the North Pole, the reindeer, the gift-giving specifically to children. Santa Claus absorbed Father Christmas's English cultural legitimacy and his association with traditional Christmas celebration. By the early 20th century, they'd become essentially the same person, with different names used interchangeably depending on where you were. In England, most people still said Father Christmas, in America Santa Claus, but they meant the same figure. And here's what's fascinating about this merger. It represented something larger happening in Victorian Christmas. The Victorians were brilliant at taking disparate traditions, some English, some German, some American. Some invented whole cloth, and weaving them into what appeared to be a seamless ancient tradition. The Christmas tree, German. Christmas cards, English invention, but recent. Carols, ancient but forgotten and then revived and rewritten. Christmas pudding, English, but its ritual significance was amplified. Santa Claus, Father Christmas, a hybrid of multiple traditions from multiple countries, presented as a timeless figure who'd always been part of Christmas. The Victorians created Christmas as we know it, but they did it so effectively that they convinced everyone, including themselves, that they were simply preserving ancient traditions. They were brilliant myth makers. But the Santa Claus myth reveals something darker when you look closely, because the central premise of Santa Claus, that he rewards good children and punishes bad ones, reinforces class divisions in a particularly cruel way. If you're a wealthy child, Santa brings you wonderful gifts, toys, books, games, sweets. This proves you've been good. You deserve these gifts because of your virtuous behavior. If you're a poor child, Santa brings you almost nothing. An apple, maybe. Some nuts. This proves you've been, what? Bad? Less deserving? Of course not. You're poor because your parents are poor, because of structural economic inequality, because of factors entirely outside your control. Your behavior has nothing to do with it. But the Santa Claus myth tells children that their Christmas gifts are based on merit, on behavior, on being good, which means poor children learn early that they're being judged and found wanting, that the abundance they see in wealthier children's lives is deserved, while their own poverty is a punishment for inadequacy. This is Victorian class ideology wrapped in a jolly red suit. The myth of meritocracy, that people get what they deserve, applied to children too young to understand that the system is rigged. Some Victorian social reformers saw this and criticised it. They pointed out that Santa Claus was a lie that reinforced inequality, that telling poor children they got less because they were bad was psychologically damaging, that the whole Santa Claus tradition was a way for wealthy people to avoid confronting their role in creating and maintaining poverty. But these criticisms didn't gain much traction. People loved Santa Claus. Children loved believing in him. Parents loved the tool he gave them for behavior management. Santa's watching. Better be good. The magic was too appealing to question too closely. And there's something genuinely beautiful about the Santa Claus myth, even with its problems. The idea that generosity exists in the world, that someone is thinking about children, caring about their happiness, working to bring them joy. In a harsh Victorian world where childhood was often brutal, child labour, child mortality, child abuse, the idea that someone magical valued children's happiness was radical. Maybe Santa Claus was Victorian culture's way of expressing how they wished the world worked. A world where generosity was abundant, where children were universally valued, where Christmas morning brought joy to everyone regardless of their economic status. The reality didn't match the myth, but the myth mattered anyway. It created an aspiration, a dream of what Christmas could be. Today, we've inherited this complicated figure. We know Santa Claus isn't real. We tell our children the truth eventually. But we maintain the myth while we can, because it makes Christmas feel magical. We post photos of our children visiting mall Santas. We leave out cookies and milk. We warn that Santa's watching. And we mostly don't think about how the Santa Claus tradition reinforces consumerism, how it makes Christmas about getting stuff, how it creates impossible expectations for parents who can't afford the good gifts. We don't think about how children compare what they got from Santa, drawing conclusions about their worth based on the presents under their tree. Or maybe we do think about it. Maybe we feel uncomfortable but don't know what to do about it. Because Santa Claus is so embedded in Christmas culture that removing him seems impossible. Like removing the tree or the carols, he's part of the package now. The Victorians gave us this complicated legacy. A Christmas that's both magical and melancholy, both generous and cruel, both inclusive and exclusive. They created traditions that brought people together while simultaneously reinforcing the divisions between them. And as Victorian Christmas reached its peak, as all these elements came together into the Christmas we recognise today, the Victorians had to ask themselves, is this enough? Have we created something beautiful? Or have we just built an elaborate facade that hides the same old problems? That question haunted them. It should haunt us too. Because everything we've explored, every tradition, every ritual, every magical moment, it all leads to one final reckoning. One final truth we need to face about what Victorian Christmas really means and what it demands from us today. Step into a department store in December 1895, the final years of Victorian England. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 58 years. She's old now, perpetually in mourning, but still the symbolic centre of an empire that spans the globe. This department store, maybe Harrods in London, maybe one of the new American-style stores that are opening in major cities, is unlike anything that existed 50 years earlier. It's a cathedral of consumption, multiple floors, electric lights, a new innovation that makes everything sparkle and gleam. Window displays featuring elaborate Christmas scenes with mechanical moving parts. Inside, there are entire departments dedicated to Christmas, ornaments for trees, toys for children, dolls, trains, toy soldiers, books, games, ready-made Christmas cards by the thousands, food halls selling ingredients for Christmas puddings and mince pies, gift wrapping services, even a Father Christmas grotto where children can meet the man himself and tell him what they want. This is what Christmas has become, an industry, an economic engine, a machine for converting anticipation and desire into purchases. The Victorians invented this, not just the traditions, the commercialization of those traditions. They were the first to realize that nostalgia, sentiment, and family obligation could be monetized. That if you created rituals that required certain products, people would buy those products. That Christmas could be good for business. And they did it so effectively that we're still living in the Christmas they created. Think about your last Christmas shopping trip, whether online or in person. The pressure you felt to buy the right gifts, the anxiety about spending enough, giving enough, being enough, the advertisements everywhere telling you that love means buying things, this sense that if you don't participate in the consumption ritual, you're somehow failing at Christmas. That's Victorian. That entire psychological complex is Victorian. Before the Victorian era, gift-giving at Christmas was modest. Small handmade items, food, maybe a book. Gifts were exchanged on New Year's Day, not Christmas Day. And there wasn't this sense that the quality and quantity of your gifts reflected your love or your worth as a person. The Victorians changed that. They moved gift-giving to Christmas Day. They made it central to the celebration. They established the expectation that everyone, especially children, would receive multiple gifts. And they created the link between consumption and sentiment that still dominates Christmas today. By the 1890s, English newspapers were already complaining about the commercialization of Christmas, about how the spiritual meaning was being lost, about how it had become all about spending money and showing off, about how the pressure to buy gifts was driving people into debt. Sound familiar? We like to think commercialized Christmas is a modern problem, that somehow we've corrupted what was once a pure, simple celebration. But the Victorians were already there. The commercialization isn't a corruption of Victorian Christmas. It's the fulfillment of Victorian Christmas. It's what they built. And here's the uncomfortable question. Was that their intention? Did they deliberately create a consumption-driven holiday? Or did it just happen as an unintended consequence of industrialization, mass production, and the rise of consumer culture? I think it's both. The Victorians genuinely wanted to create beautiful, meaningful traditions. They wanted Christmas to bring families together. They wanted to give children magical experiences. They wanted to recreate a sense of communal celebration that they felt was being lost in the industrial age. But they were also capitalists living in a capitalist society. They ran businesses. They needed to make money. And Christmas, with its annual predictability and its emotional intensity, was a perfect opportunity for profit. So they created traditions that required products. A Christmas tree requires ornaments, lights, a star or angel for the top. Carol singing requires printed sheet music. Christmas dinner requires special foods. Gift giving requires, well, gifts. And the more elaborate the tradition, the more opportunities for spending. The genius of Victorian Christmas, if we can call it genius, is that the consumption feels meaningful. It doesn't feel like capitalism. It feels like love. When you buy Christmas ornaments, you're not just consuming, you're creating family memories. When you buy gifts, you're expressing affection. When you buy ingredients for Christmas pudding, you're participating in tradition. The capitalism is camouflaged as culture, and we can't separate them anymore. Try to imagine Christmas without buying things. No gifts, no decorations, no special food, just family time and spiritual reflection. It feels wrong, doesn't it? It feels like that wouldn't be Christmas. Like you'd be depriving your children of something essential. That feeling, that sense that consumption is necessary for Christmas to be real, that's the Victorian legacy. But here's where it gets complicated. Because while the commercialization is real and problematic, the emotional needs that Christmas addresses are also real. People do need rituals. They need time set apart from ordinary life. They need excuses to gather with family and friends. They need symbolic ways to express love and connection. They need magic, especially during the darkest time of the year. The Victorians understood this. Whatever else we can say about Victorian Christmas, it worked psychologically. It gave people what they needed, meaning connection, hope, beauty, a sense of something larger than daily drudgery. The problem is that they wrapped those genuine human needs in consumption. They made it so you couldn't have the meaning without the spending. They fused capitalism and culture so thoroughly that we struggle to separate them even when we want to. Think about Scrooge's transformation in A Christmas Carol. What does he do after his redemption? He buys things. He sends the Cratchits a turkey. He makes donations. He becomes a generous consumer. His moral awakening is expressed through spending money. Dickens meant this positively. He was saying, use your wealth to help others. Be generous. Don't hoard. But notice that the solution to social problems in A Christmas Carol is individual charity, not structural change. It's Scrooge giving, not society redistributing wealth or creating systems that would prevent the Cratchits from being poor in the first place. This is very Victorian. They loved the idea of charity. They loved generous individuals. What they didn't love was questioning the economic system that created the need for charity in the first place, and this legacy continues. We have charity drives at Christmas, food banks, toy drives, angel trees where you can buy gifts for children whose families can't afford them. It's beautiful. It's genuinely helpful. People benefit from this generosity. But it's also a way of not addressing systemic poverty, of making poverty someone else's problem that we solve through optional generosity rather than mandatory justice. The Victorians gave us a Christmas that makes us feel good about inequality while doing nothing to eliminate it. Is that too harsh? Maybe. Many Victorian social reformers did advocate for structural change: the settlement house movement, labour unions, education reform, public health initiatives. Lots of Victorians saw that charity wasn't enough, but Christmas itself, the holiday as they constructed it, that's about individual generosity within an unchanged system. That's about making poverty visible enough to trigger charitable feelings, but not visible enough to trigger revolutionary anger. We've inherited this same approach. We acknowledge poverty at Christmas. We feel bad about it. We donate. We feel better. And then we go back to our lives and nothing fundamental changes. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we navigate Victorian Christmas in the 21st century? I don't have a perfect answer. But I think we need to start by being honest about what we're doing. When we celebrate Christmas, we're not participating in an ancient tradition handed down through millennia. We're performing Victorian rituals that are about 150 to 180 years old. Rituals that were designed, intentionally or not, to serve the needs of an industrial, capitalist, imperial society. Some of those rituals are beautiful and worth keeping. Gathering with family, singing together, creating beauty in the darkness, telling stories, acknowledging loss and grief as well as joy. These are human needs that transcend any particular economic system. But other parts, the consumption, the performance of abundance, the Christmas as social competition, we could let those go. We could decide that Christmas doesn't have to be about how much we spend or how perfectly we perform the traditions. The Victorians themselves were making choices about what Christmas meant. They revived some old traditions and invented new ones. They emphasized certain aspects of the holiday and downplayed others. They were active creators, not passive inheritors. We can be creators too. We can keep what works and release what doesn't. We can acknowledge the melancholy alongside the magic. We can celebrate without consuming ourselves into debt. We can be generous without pretending generosity solves structural injustice. The most valuable thing the Victorians gave us might not be any specific tradition. It might be the example of cultural creativity itself, the understanding that traditions can be reinvented, that holidays can evolve to meet changing needs, that we have agency in how we celebrate. Victorian Christmas wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, constructed, built deliberately by people making decisions about what they valued and what they wanted Christmas to mean. Our Christmas isn't inevitable either. We're making choices every time we celebrate. Mostly we're choosing to repeat what we learned, to do what's expected, to perform the rituals we inherited. But we could choose differently. We could create a Christmas that keeps the magic, the beauty, the connection, the ritual marking of winter solstice, the acknowledgement that darkness and light coexist, while releasing some of the melancholy. Not the honest melancholy of grief and loss, which should be honoured, but the melancholy of inequality, of consumption pressure, of performance anxiety. The Victorians couldn't fully do this. They were too embedded in their economic system, too committed to their class hierarchy, too convinced that capitalism and Christianity could be reconciled without tension. But we have the benefit of hindsight. We can see what they built and understand both its beauty and its flaws. We can appreciate their creativity while recognizing their limitations, and maybe, just maybe, we can do better. Not by abandoning Victorian Christmas entirely, but by being conscious inheritors rather than unconscious performers, by asking why we do what we do, by choosing which traditions to keep and which to release, by creating new rituals that address 21st century needs rather than 19th century ones. The question isn't whether to celebrate Christmas. For most of us, Christmas is too embedded in our culture, our psychology, our calendar, to simply opt out. The question is how to celebrate, what to emphasize, what to let go. And that brings us to the final truth about Victorian Christmas, the one that encompasses everything we've explored, that makes sense of all the contradictions, all the beauty and darkness, all the magic and melancholy that define this strange and wonderful invention. It's a truth that the Victorians knew but couldn't quite face, a truth that still haunts our celebrations today. January 22nd, 1901, Osborne House, Isle of Wight. Queen Victoria is dying. She's 81 years old. She's been queen for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. Her reign has defined an entire age. Around her bed, her children and grandchildren gather. The room is sombre, but not silent. Someone is reading prayers. Someone else is holding her hand. The windows are open. Victoria requested this, wanting to see the sky one last time. On a table near the window, barely visible in the January light, stands something that seems almost absurdly out of place. A small decorated evergreen tree. Even in her final moments, Victoria has a Christmas tree nearby. Not because it's Christmas, it's late January, but because the tree has become so associated with her life, with her marriage to Albert, with everything their reign represented. It's been 40 years since Albert died. 40 Christmases. Victoria celebrated without him. And every single year she maintained all the traditions he introduced. The tree, the decorations, the gifts laid out on tables, the family gatherings, everything exactly as Albert would have wanted it. She did this partly from love, keeping Albert's memory alive, but also partly from duty. She understood that she and Albert had created something larger than themselves, that Victorian Christmas had become part of British identity, part of what it meant to be modern, civilized, progressive. When Victoria dies that January afternoon, an era ends. Literally, the Victorian era concludes. Her son Edward becomes king, ushering in the Edwardian period. Everything is about to change. The 20th century is already underway, bringing technologies and social transformations the Victorians could barely imagine. But Victorian Christmas, that doesn't end. It continues, evolves, spreads around the world, becomes so universal that most people don't even realize it is Victorian at all. This is the final truth about Victorian Christmas. It succeeded beyond the Victorians' wildest dreams and failed in ways they never anticipated. Let me explain what I mean. The success is obvious. Nearly every Christmas tradition you practice, wherever you are in the world, comes from Victorian England. The tree, the cards, the carols, the turkey or goose dinner, the pudding, the stockings, Father Christmas or Santa Claus, the emphasis on family, the focus on children, the gift-giving, the decorations, even the timing. Christmas as a multi-day celebration centered on December 25th, rather than a 12-day festival starting that day. The Victorians took a dying holiday and made it the most celebrated secular religious festival in Western culture. They created traditions that crossed borders, transcended religions, adapted to local customs while maintaining core elements. Victorian Christmas became global. That's an extraordinary achievement. Most cultural innovations don't spread like that. Most traditions remain local, specific to one place or one people. But Victorian Christmas went everywhere. To America, obviously, the country's shared language and cultural connections, but also to Australia, to South Africa, to India, to Japan, to South America. Anywhere British influence reached, and then beyond. Today you can find Christmas trees in shopping malls in Dubai, in Buddhist-majority Thailand, in atheist China. You can hear Silent Night in dozens of languages. Children who've never heard of Queen Victoria or Prince Albert hang stockings and wait for Santa Claus. The Victorians created a template for celebration that proved remarkably durable and adaptable. Whatever else we can say about them, they understood human needs. They knew how to create rituals that resonate across cultures and generations. But here's the failure, and it's a profound one. Victorian Christmas was supposed to solve social problems. It was supposed to address poverty, inequality, suffering. That was the explicit message of Dickens' A Christmas Carol and countless other Victorian Christmas stories, that the spirit of Christmas would inspire generosity, would bridge the gap between rich and poor, would create a more just and compassionate society. It didn't. Poverty didn't end. Inequality didn't disappear. The workhouses continued operating for another century. The class system that created such suffering remained intact, remains intact today in different forms. Christmas became an annual ritual of acknowledging problems without fixing them. A time when we feel generous without becoming just. A moment when we recognize human need without addressing systemic causes. The Victorians wanted Christmas to change hearts, and it did, momentarily. But changed hearts don't necessarily lead to changed systems. Feelings of generosity don't automatically translate into political action or economic restructuring. So we inherited a Christmas that's both more and less than the Victorians intended. More in its spread and popularity, less in its transformative power, and yet, I don't think we should dismiss Victorian Christmas as a failure, because even though it didn't solve poverty or create the just society Dickens imagined, it did something else, something maybe more modest but still valuable. It insisted that celebration matters, that beauty matters, that marking the darkest time of year with light and warmth and connection matters, that acknowledging what we've lost, through ghost stories, through remembrance, through including empty chairs in our awareness, matters. The Victorians understood something we sometimes forget. Humans need more than material survival. We need meaning. We need ritual. We need moments that feel sacred, that stand apart from ordinary time, that connect us to something larger than our individual lives. Christmas does that, imperfectly, problematically, wrapped up in consumption and commercialism and all the other issues we've explored. But it does it. When you decorate a tree, you're participating in a ritual of bringing light into darkness that goes back thousands of years, to pre-Christian winter festivals, to Victorian parlors, to your grandmother's house, to now. You're part of a chain of human beings reaching across time, all doing the same thing for the same reason, because winter is dark and we need beauty. When you sing carols, you're joining your voice with millions of others. You're creating something together that can't exist alone. You're experiencing what community sounds like. When you give gifts, even in our over-commercialized system, you're participating in an ancient human impulse to share, to show care through tangible objects, to say, I thought about what would make you happy. When you gather with family, even if that family is complicated, even if those gatherings are sometimes difficult, you're honoring the human need for connection, for knowing you belong somewhere, for having people who witness your life. The Victorians gave us a framework for doing all of this. Yes, that framework has problems. Yes, we need to be conscious about what we're doing and why. Yes, we can and should adapt and change and create new traditions that serve our needs better. But we can also be grateful. We can appreciate what works even while questioning what doesn't. And we can remember both sides of Victorian Christmas, the magic and the melancholy, because both are true, both are real, both matter. Christmas is joyful and sad. It's abundant and lacking. It brings people together and reveals divisions. It's a time of generosity and inequality. It's magic and it's commerce. It's spiritual and it's material. It's ancient and it's Victorian and it's modern and it's whatever we make it. The Victorians taught us to hold both truths simultaneously, to acknowledge darkness while creating light, to feel grief while celebrating joy, to see suffering while experiencing beauty. That's their real gift to us. Not any particular tradition, but the capacity to embrace complexity, to reject the simplistic either-or and accept the difficult both-and. So this Christmas, whether you celebrate it religiously or secularly or not at all, maybe think about Victoria and Albert standing beside their tree at Windsor Castle. Think about Charles Dickens walking the streets of London, seeing poverty and imagining how stories could change hearts. Think about the workhouse inmates eating their Christmas dinner, grateful for food but longing for freedom. Think about the carolers singing in the cold, their voices rising together in the darkness. Think about all of it, the whole complicated, contradictory, beautiful, terrible legacy, and then decide, consciously, deliberately, what your Christmas means, what traditions you'll keep, what you'll change, what you'll create new, because that's what the Victorians did. They didn't passively accept Christmas as they found it. They actively created the Christmas they needed. We can do the same. We can take their inventions and make them ours. We can honor their creativity while moving beyond their limitations. We can keep the magic while addressing the melancholy. We can celebrate without pretending celebration solves everything. We can acknowledge darkness while still lighting candles against it. That's the final lesson of Victorian Christmas. It's not about preserving traditions unchanged. It's about understanding that traditions are living things, constantly being recreated by the people who practice them. You're not just celebrating Christmas, you're creating it. Every choice you make about how to observe the holiday, what to emphasize, what to downplay, what to change, what to keep, you're participating in the ongoing invention of Christmas. The Victorians started something, but they didn't finish it. They couldn't. Because traditions don't finish. They continue, evolving with each generation, adapting to new contexts, serving new needs. Victorian Christmas is dead. Long live Christmas. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through Victorian Christmas, through the magic and the melancholy, through the beauty and the darkness, through the traditions that shaped how we celebrate today. I hope you've discovered something new or seen something familiar in a different light, or felt connected to those people across time who are grappling with the same questions we face. How do we create meaning? How do we celebrate together? How do we hold both joy and sorrow? How do we make light in the darkness? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it changed how you see Christmas even a little bit, please share it. Leave a comment telling me what tradition means most to you, or what you learned tonight, or where you're listening from. I read every single one, and I love hearing your thoughts. And there are more stories waiting, more journeys into the past that illuminate the present, more hidden histories of the traditions we think we know. So subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications, because the next story is already calling, and I think you're going to want to hear it. Until then, whether you celebrate Christmas or not, whether it's summer where you are or winter, whether you're surrounded by family or sitting alone, I hope you find light in the darkness. I hope you find connection. I hope you find moments of magic alongside the melancholy that's part of being human. Sleep well, dream well, and I'll see you in the next story. Good night.